Bonjour mes chers amis, sehr geehrter Herr Staatssekretär, lieber Herr Schnorr, Madame la sénatrice, chère Corinne Narassiguin, que je suis particulièrement heureux d'accueillir aujourd'hui et de retrouver après notre période commune aux États-Unis. Merci beaucoup d'être avec nous. Sehr geehrter Herr Bundestagsabgeordneter, lieber Herr Außendorf, Monsieur le professeur, cher Philippe Aghion, qui est avec nous, je crois, en visio.
Oui, absolument.
Chers intervenants, mesdames et messieurs, chers amis, c'est un immense plaisir pour mon équipe et pour moi de vous accueillir aujourd'hui à l'ambassade de France et d'ouvrir ce dialogue préparé avec nos partenaires du centre Jacques Delors de la RT School, que je remercie très chaleureusement. Comme je vous remercie toutes et tous pour votre collaboration pour l'organisation de cet événement, avec un mot particulier pour toi, cher Johannes Lindner. Et je mentionne également l'équipe de l'ambassade, Siegfried Martin-Diaz pour le service scientifique et Claire Thiriot-Kant pour le service économique régional. Alors cette rencontre s'inscrit également dans le cadre du dialogue Pariser Platz, série d'événements franco-allemands soutenus par l'Auswärtiges Amt, dont je salue également l'implication. Et cette série a été initiée, comme vous le savez, par Henrik Enderlein. Je crois savoir que Isabelle Enderlein est avec nous ou sera avec nous aujourd'hui. J'en suis très heureux. Pour ce nouveau dialogue, nous avons choisi donc d'aborder le sujet de l'intelligence artificielle. Et c'est à mon sens, pour le dire un peu cash, le sujet central aujourd'hui, y compris dans le cadre de mes fonctions actuelles comme ambassadeur de France à Berlin, et cela pour deux raisons complémentaires. D'abord parce que c'est largement sur ce sujet et celui des révolutions technologiques en cours que se joue notre avenir, y compris notre avenir comme Européens, et si vous me permettez le mot, comme puissance. Chacun le voit bien, la souveraineté technologique de l'Europe est la clé qui conditionne les autres formes de souveraineté européenne, y compris la souveraineté économique bien sûr, et géopolitique. Or, chacun le voit bien aussi, l'Europe est menacée aujourd'hui de décrochage, je vais parler doucement pour la traduction, notamment par les États-Unis et par la Chine, lesquels sont favorisés, il faut le dire aussi, les États-Unis et la Chine, par leur taille, bien sûr, mais aussi par des formes souvent agressives de protectionnisme et d'intervention de l'État, ce qui sera, je l'espère, un thème de votre discussion. Nous sommes donc, nous, Européens, face à un mur d'investissement, ou plutôt face à trois murs d'investissement sur la transformation digitale, sur la transition écologique et énergétique, et, c'est un autre sujet, sur la défense et la mise à niveau nécessaire de notre effort de défense. Ce besoin de financement est bien documenté, y compris pour l'intelligence artificielle. Il mobilise d'ailleurs, c'est un autre sujet que le vôtre, beaucoup de nos efforts sur l'union des marchés de capitaux, par exemple, pour mobiliser les capitaux privés dans le financement des 2+1 transitions que j'évoquais, le +1 étant la défense. Rien que pour la France, le rapport récent de la Commission pour l'intelligence artificielle, co-présidé par le professeur Philippe Aghion, donc rien que pour la France, ce rapport estime que nous aurons besoin de 25 milliards d'euros d'investissement sur 5 ans, au bas mot, pour relever le défi technologique de l'intelligence artificielle. Le rapport de Mario Draghi, remis à la présidente de la Commission européenne en septembre, le souligne également. Le retard accumulé en matière d'intelligence artificielle, en matière d'investissement dans les nouvelles technologies plus largement, afin de relancer la croissance et la productivité en Europe est considérable. Et M. Draghi préconise dans ce cadre de porter à 200 milliards d'euros le budget du prochain programme cadre de recherche et d'innovation. Donc le constat est partagé, unanime, et il est alarmiste. Je crois qu'il faut le garder à l'esprit. La deuxième raison pour laquelle ce sujet de l'IA est central, y compris ici à l'ambassade de France, c'est qu'il conditionne largement, à mes yeux, l'avenir du franco-allemand. Après le chapitre de la réconciliation franco-allemande, ouvert par De Gaulle et Adenauer dans les années 60, tout l'enjeu du franco-allemand aujourd'hui, me semble-t-il, est d'ouvrir un nouveau chapitre qui, outre les sujets économiques et géopolitiques, soit centré sur les trois révolutions technologiques en cours, la révolution digitale, la révolution des sciences de la vie et la révolution, encore une fois, écologique et de l'énergie. Et l'IA est l'élément central, le nœud en quelque sorte, de ces trois révolutions qui combinent leurs effets. L'avenir du franco-allemand va se mesurer largement dans la capacité de nos deux pays à concevoir ensemble ces révolutions technologiques et à conduire ensemble cette révolution en termes d'efforts de recherche, de rapprochement des écosystèmes d'innovation et de partenariats industriels. Mutatis mutandis, comme on dit de manière un peu pédante en français, il nous revient aujourd'hui de faire en franco-allemand, avec les nouvelles révolutions technologiques que j'évoquais, ce que nous avons réussi à faire dans les années 50 avec ce que l'on appelait la communauté européenne du charbon et de l'acier, sur l'intuition de Jean Monnet, qui a été l'élément déclencheur du processus européen. Eh bien aujourd'hui, je crois qu'on en est là. On est face à ce mur d'investissement, face à ce mur technologique, et les Européens n'ont pas d'autre choix que de retrousser leurs manches et en effet de définir une communauté d'action sur ces révolutions technologiques et d'abord sur l'intelligence artificielle. Posons-nous la question à contrario. Que signifierait le franco-allemand et même par extension la construction européenne si nous n'avions aucun message, si nous n'avions aucune prise sur des révolutions technologiques qui vont bouleverser la hiérarchie de la puissance à l'échelle internationale, qui vont transformer de fond en comble nos économies et d'abord nos industries, et qui tout simplement vont bouleverser nos vies. Alors franchement, si le franco-allemand n'a rien à dire sur ces sujets, on peut faire autre chose. Je crois que c'est important, et notamment pour les jeunes générations, de l'avoir à l'esprit. Cette révolution technologique, elle doit donc, me semble-t-il, être l'avenir, j'allais dire la nouvelle frontière, si j'ose, du franco-allemand. Alors nous ne partons heureusement pas d'une page blanche, et un important travail a déjà été engagé en ce sens. Au niveau politique, le traité d'Aix-la-Chapelle de 2019 accorde déjà une place importante et expressément à l'intelligence artificielle, dont il fait une priorité de la coopération entre nos deux pays. Sur la base du traité d'Aix-la-Chapelle, une première feuille de route commune franco-allemande a été établie la même année, en 2019. Elle est très complète et elle aborde autant les aspects de recherche et d'innovation que la dimension industrielle et économique. Cette feuille de route a eu une accroche opérationnelle puisqu'elle a été la source à partir duquel vous avez eu plusieurs appels à projets conjoints et puis un effort de concertation permanent, ce qui n'est pas rien, entre les deux pays. Et nos deux pays travaillent aujourd'hui soit à l'amélioration de cette feuille de route, soit, ce que je préconise, à l'élaboration d'une nouvelle feuille de route plus ambitieuse et toujours dans une perspective européenne. Le chancelier Scholz et le président de la République ont réaffirmé à plusieurs reprises, y compris très récemment, leur volonté de faire de l'IA une priorité commune en franco-allemand. Ça a été le cas lors de plusieurs exercices récents. La France et l'Allemagne se sont engagées à accélérer leur partenariat et à approfondir leur partenariat sur de nombreux points cruciaux dans ce cadre, tels que le rapprochement et le renforcement de nos capacités de calcul, une meilleure attraction des talents dans nos centres de recherche en Europe, un meilleur partage des données et un effort particulier dans le domaine de l'IA verticale en vue d'une bonne diffusion de l'intelligence artificielle dans le tissu industriel de nos pays. Le président de la République se rendra également demain, c'est peut-être pourquoi j'ai l'air aussi fatigué, à Berlin, pour participer au Berlin Global Dialogue. Et dans ce cadre, il participera à une table ronde particulière sur ce domaine de l'intelligence artificielle. Le nouveau gouvernement récemment nommé à Paris intègre directement l'intelligence artificielle dans son champ d'action. Une secrétaire d'État en charge de l'IA et du numérique a été nommée auprès du ministre de l'Enseignement supérieur et de la Recherche et aura à cœur donc de renforcer l'action de la France dans ce domaine. Cette ministre, je vous donne son nom, il s'agit de Clara Chapaz, qui dirigeait jusqu'à présent ce qu'on appelle la French Tech, avec lequel je pense vous êtes tous familiarisés. Et à l'initiative du président de la République et dans la continuité des sommets précédents, la France accueillera également les 10 et 11 février prochains le sommet pour l'action sur l'IA. Donc février prochain à Paris, Big Summit on the Artificial Intelligence. Ce sommet aura pour objectif d'incuber et de lancer des initiatives concrètes contribuant à mettre l'IA au service du bien commun, c'est son objectif, avec plusieurs domaines de travail identifiés, 5 en particulier pour ce sommet, soutenir les écosystèmes d'innovation et de création, permettre le développement d'une IA sûre pour nos concitoyens, anticiper l'avenir de l'IA dans le monde du travail, valoriser l'IA dans le service public et au service du bien commun, et mettre en place une gouvernance mondiale et inclusive de l'IA. Vous voyez, le programme est large, and you recognize here the long tradition of French modesty and French humility, which is really at the heart of our DNA. Plus sérieusement, c'est vrai que ce sommet mondial, il offre une perspective intéressante dans laquelle le franco-allemand, l'européen ont toute leur place et dont l'objectif est bien de valoriser l'attractivité de notre système et de notre écosystème européen. Ça, c'est pour le niveau politique ou macro, si j'ose dire, où la priorité de l'IA est donc clairement affirmée, y compris en franco-allemand. Ce qui me frappe aussi, et là je ne développerai pas, mais ça me frappe beaucoup, c'est la vitalité des relations entre nos deux pays, les entreprises, les chercheurs, les start-up, la vitalité des partenariats engagés entre nos deux pays au niveau des efforts de recherche. Et nous avons la chance d'avoir en 2025 le Forum pour la recherche franco-allemand, qui sera une formidable machine à faire converger les efforts de recherche de nos deux pays. C'est vrai également au niveau du rapprochement que j'évoquais de nos écosystèmes d'innovation. C'est vrai au niveau de la convergence de ce qu'on appelle le capital risque, en bon français, le venture capital. Et là, le fait est que l'Allemagne, à travers l'initiative WIN, récemment annoncée par le chancelier, s'est directement inspirée, chère Claire, de l'initiative TIBI développée en France pour mobiliser les investisseurs institutionnels en appui au capital risque. Et donc, c'est une convergence qui est également importante. Les partenariats industriels, je n'y reviens pas, sont nombreux. Et dans ce cadre, eh bien, la French Tech est un acteur de grande qualité de ce rapprochement franco-allemand. J'étais hier à Munich pour la remise des French Tech Awards, qui a été un très grand succès à l'occasion du salon Beats and Pretzels. Et je sais que Marie-Avril Rousteing-Kühler est là, ou devrait être là bientôt, elle qui préside la French Tech ici à Berlin. Je m'arrête là, vous souhaite surtout des discussions très productives. Sachez que vous aurez toujours à l'ambassade avec moi et surtout avec les excellentes équipes de l'ambassade des interlocuteurs passionnés, je crois que vous le voyez, et engagés. Et de même, je vous encourage à être chacune et chacun d'entre vous des acteurs engagés du franco-allemand dans cette période critique et des acteurs engagés du franco-allemand, en particulier dans le domaine crucial de l'intelligence artificielle. Un grand merci à vous tous et toutes. Merci.
Ja, sehr geehrter Herr Botschafter, vielen Dank für die nette Begrüßung. Sehr geehrter Herr, zugeschaltet ist er ja, Professor Aguillon. Auch Ihnen einen herzlichen Gruß nach Paris, hier aus Berlin, meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren. Ich freue mich sehr und es ist mir eine große Ehre und ich bin sehr stolz, Herr Botschafter, heute hier bei Ihnen in der französischen Botschaft zu sprechen für diese wirklich spannende Veranstaltung zum Thema künstliche Intelligenz. Es ist das entscheidende Thema, glaube ich, in der Tat für die Zukunft Europas. Was braucht Europa, um bei der künstlichen Intelligenz wettbewerbsfähig zu sein? Und wenn wir von der künstlichen Intelligenz reden, dann reden wir letztlich von der gesamten Digitalisierung in allen Lebensbereichen und wir reden letztlich in der Tat davon, dass Europa zukunftsfähig bleibt, denn ohne diese Technologie werden wir das nicht tun. Und ich kann, sehr geehrter Herr Botschafter, Ihnen gleich mit auf den Weg geben, die Zusammenarbeit zwischen der deutschen Bundesregierung, nicht nur meinem Ministerium, Sie haben viele andere Bereiche eben genannt, und den Kolleginnen und Kollegen in Frankreich läuft hervorragend seit vielen, vielen Jahren. Und ich bin davon überzeugt, dass Sie auch mit der neuen Regierung, die wir jetzt in Frankreich haben, genauso gut zusammenarbeiten werden. Sie erwähnten den AI Summit im Februar in Paris nächstes Jahr. Und ich habe meine Kollegin beim letzten Summit in Südkorea auch getroffen. Und wir haben dort auch bereits vereinbart, dass wir gemeinsam sehr eng zusammenarbeiten, um diesen Summit in Paris und damit in Europa zu einem großen Erfolg werden zu lassen. Wir müssen im Bereich Digitalisierung, künstliche Intelligenz in Europa enger zusammenarbeiten. Wir werden enger zusammenarbeiten und wir wollen das auch. Und ich glaube, dass die deutsch-französische Achse hier ein entscheidender Faktor ist. Fakt ist, meine Damen und Herren, derzeit, und der Botschafter hat bereits darauf hingewiesen, sind es vor allem die USA und China, die zumindest bei generativen KI-Modellen das Tempo vorgeben. Fakt ist aber auch, wir stehen erst am Anfang des KI-Zeitalters. Ich habe gestern in der Zeitung gelesen, der Hype um KI sei vorbei. Aber ich sage mal, das Ganze wird jetzt mehr oder weniger Teil unseres Lebens. Dann ist es kein Hype mehr, aber es ist Teil unseres Lebens. Und nochmal, wir sind am Anfang. Vieles steht noch vor uns und deswegen müssen wir zusammenarbeiten. Und ich glaube, dass wir in Europa hier auch eine gute Ausgangsposition haben. Mit dem Europäischen AI Act hat die Europäische Union das erste Gesetz für vertrauenswürdige und sichere künstliche Intelligenz verabschiedet. Und Anfang des Jahres hat die Europäische Kommission zudem Hochleistungscomputer für europäische KI-Start-ups geöffnet im Rahmen der European High Performance Computing Initiative. Und auch das ist in der Tat ein ganz, ganz wichtiges Thema, Zugang zu Rechenkapazitäten. Und last but not least, am 10. September diesen Jahres hat die EU-Kommission einen Aufruf zur Einrichtung von AI-Factories an den jeweiligen HPC-Hochleistungsrechnern Standorten ausgeschrieben. Einreichungen sind hier noch bis zum 4. November möglich und 1 Milliarde stellt die Kommission hierfür auch zur Verfügung. So gesehen ein 25. der 25 Milliarden, die Herr Botschafter gerade genannt hat, über das Programm Digital Europe und über das Programm Horizon Europe. Diese europäischen AI Factories werden dazu beitragen, die europäische Position an der Spitze auch dieser Technologie voranzubringen, zu sichern und auszubauen. Und das ist entscheidend, denn um im KI-Wettrennen mitspielen zu können, und zwar nicht in der zweiten, in der dritten Reihe, sondern in der ersten Reihe, brauchen wir den Aufbau eines souveränen europäischen KI-Ökosystems. Kein einzelner Akteur kann das leisten, kein einzelner Akteur kann die Wettbewerbsfähigkeit Europas alleine sichern. Wir brauchen, und auch darauf hat der Botschafter bereits hingewiesen, wir brauchen ein Ökosystem. Und zwar ein Ökosystem aus Forschung, aus Wirtschaft, aus Start-ups, aus Politik. Wir müssen hier alle zusammenarbeiten und jeder muss in diesem Teil seinen Beitrag leisten. Und ich kann wirklich nur unterstützen, wir werden unsere Beiträge in diesem Bereich leisten. Das kann ich für Deutschland sagen. Das kann ich nach dem, was Herr Botschafter gesagt hat und alledem, was ich von den französischen Kollegen weiß. Das werden die französischen Kolleginnen und Kollegen auch tun. Eine Studie des Instituts der deutschen Wirtschaft, meine Damen und Herren, schätzt, dass die KI eine zusätzliche Wertschöpfung alleine für Deutschland in einer Größenordnung von 330 Milliarden Euro ermöglicht. 330 Milliarden Euro. Umso wichtiger ist es, dass wir KI auch in den Unternehmen voranbringen. Allerdings werden in den Unternehmen in Deutschland, und ich vermute, in Frankreich ist es nicht viel anders, die Möglichkeiten, die Potenziale der künstlichen Intelligenz noch zu wenig genutzt. Nur etwa jedes 8. deutsche Unternehmen setzt derzeit künstliche Intelligenz ein. Das sind 12%. Wenn wir auf die etwas größeren Unternehmen schauen mit über 250 Mitarbeitern, dann sind es zwar 35%, aber auch 35% sind keine 100. Hier ist also definitiv noch Luft nach oben. Voraussetzung ist natürlich, dass diese Technologien auch eingesetzt werden, dass wir die Unternehmen, dass wir die Wirtschaft dabei unterstützen. Das tun wir vielfältig, unter anderem in meinem Ministerium mit dem Förderprogramm Mission KI. Es ist ein Hebelprojekt der Digitalstrategie der deutschen Bundesregierung und wir wollen damit die Wettbewerbsfähigkeit, die digitale Wettbewerbsfähigkeit der deutschen Wirtschaft stärken. Alle Ministerien arbeiten in diesem Bereich sehr intensiv. Deswegen verzeihen Sie mir, wenn ich ein Programm herausgreife, das wir im Moment machen. Hier bieten wir unter anderem, was sehr wichtig ist, ein Matchmaking an zwischen KI-Unternehmen und zwischen Unternehmen und zwischen KI-Startups, um sozusagen die besten Köpfe zusammenzubringen. Das erste hatten wir im Juli in Heilbronn und es wird viele weitere solche Matchmaking-Veranstaltungen geben. Sie führen letztlich dazu, dass KI-Startups den Zugang zu den Unternehmen bekommen, zu realen Anwendungsfällen und nicht nur zu theoretischen Debatten und dass die Unternehmen ihrerseits mit KI-Technologie ihre Wettbewerbsfähigkeit, egal in welchen Branchen das ist, entsprechend ausbauen und stärken können. Entscheidend ist in diesem Zusammenhang natürlich, dass künstliche Intelligenz, dass die Anwendungen vertrauenswürdig sind. Nur dann werden sie letztlich von den Unternehmen, aber auch von uns, den Bürgerinnen und Bürgern, akzeptiert. Auch darum geht es in unserem Programm Mission KI. Wir entwickeln hier übrigens nicht nur isoliert in Deutschland, sondern natürlich mit europäischen Partnern, auch den französischen Partnern, praxistaugliche, freiwillige Qualitätsstandards, anschlussfähig an den EU AI Act. Und wir bieten hier über diesen Standard Kriterien, die wir gemeinsam entwickeln, Prüfverfahren und auch Prüfmethoden, die dann letztlich untersucht und auch erprobt werden können, um die Marktfähigkeit von KI-Anwendungen auch sicherzustellen. Und gleichzeitig schafft ein neuer Standard bei Anwendern damit dann auch das nötige Vertrauen für den breiteren KI-Einsatz, sodass wir damit auch die Anwendung von KI in den Unternehmen auf der einen Seite beschleunigen und damit auch wiederum die europäische Position im internationalen Wettbewerb verbessern können. Außerdem schaffen wir für die Unternehmen, gerade für die kleinen und mittleren Unternehmen natürlich, aber auch für Forscherinnen und Forscher, die Möglichkeit, in unseren KI-Innovations- und Qualitätszentren, die wir sukzessive in Deutschland aufbauen, vor Ort wirklich auch eine Anlaufstelle zu haben, wo man genau diese Dinge, Standardentwicklung, Erprobung von Anwendungen durchführen kann. Das erste Zentrum haben wir in Kaiserslautern eröffnet im Juli, dort wo das Deutsche Forschungszentrum für künstliche Intelligenz ist, um auch die Synergieeffekte, die wir hier haben, tatsächlich nutzen zu können. Und Unternehmen werden dort ganz konkret beraten und unterstützt bei der Einführung von KI. Und damit die Bürgerinnen und Bürger ebenfalls ein Verständnis bekommen und auch die Vertrauenswürdigkeit nachvollziehen können, werden wir im kommenden Jahr hier im Deutschen Technikmuseum in Berlin ein Zentrum für Bürgerinnen und Bürger eröffnen, wo wir konkrete Anwendungsfälle mit dem Hintergrund sozusagen, wie kommt man zu diesen Ergebnissen, vorstellen wollen, Nachvollziehbarkeit von KI, auch das ein wichtiges Thema. Ein anderes Thema, mit dem wir uns gerade jetzt im Kontext mit Wahlen, Europawahlen, Landtagswahlen, es gibt weitere große Wahlen, die bevorstehen, beschäftigen konnten und mussten, das sind die sogenannten Deepfakes. Wir alle kennen das, ein Riesenproblem und durch KI können diese Deepfakes natürlich deutlich rasanter sich ausbreiten, als das in der Vergangenheit der Fall war. Auch hier brauchen wir schnell praxistaugliche Lösungen, um Deepfakes zu erkennen und zu verhindern, damit wir als Konsumentinnen und Konsumenten auch wirklich wissen, was ist denn das vor mir? Ist das echt oder ist das ein Deepfake? Wir haben dafür einen Wettbewerb gestartet über die Agentur für Sprunginnovationen in Deutschland, die sogenannte Sprint, um gemeinsam mit den Interessierten, die sich dort auskennen, Modelle zu entwickeln, wie wir hier am besten Deepfakes erkennen können. Die Unternehmen sagen uns, wir arbeiten ja intensiv daran. Trotz alledem haben wir entdeckt, es gibt immer noch sehr, sehr viele Deepfakes. Vielleicht gibt es bessere Methoden, um sie zu entdecken. Und da wollen wir auch unseren Beitrag zu leisten, diese Dinge nach vorne zu bringen. Wir kümmern uns also um die Unternehmen. Wir kümmern uns aber eben auch um die Menschen, die letztlich KI nutzen. Wir wollen ein positives Signal senden. Ja, KI ist etwas Tolles, ohne dass wir selbstverständlich die Risiken hier aus den Augen verlieren wollen. Und um das zu ermöglichen, Förderung, Unterstützung auf der einen Seite, wir brauchen aber auch ein Umfeld, ein regulatorisches Umfeld, das Innovationen ermöglicht und Innovationen nicht verhindert. Und das ist Aufgabe der Politik. Und daran arbeiten wir in Deutschland, daran arbeiten Sie in Frankreich und daran müssen wir auf europäischer Ebene arbeiten, denn wir müssen nicht nur, aber auch im Bereich der Digitalisierung den europäischen Binnenmarkt nicht nur als Floskel gelten lassen, sondern im praktischen Leben auch tatsächlich umsetzen. Die EU hat in den vergangenen Jahren vieles auf den Weg gebracht zur Vollendung des digitalen Binnenmarktes. Klammer auf, er ist noch nicht vollendet, aber wir sind auf einem guten Weg. Ich nenne neben dem EU AI Act Regulatorik wie beispielsweise den Digital Service Act, die eIDAS-Verordnung, den Gigabit Infrastructure Act oder auch den Data Act. Alles wichtige Bausteine für eine Vereinheitlichung in Europa, für den europäischen Binnenmarkt. Jetzt geht es darum, diese Regularien in nationales Recht umzusetzen und sie so umzusetzen, dass wir tatsächlich, ich sage es nochmal, weil man kann es nicht häufig genug sagen, dass wir einen gemeinsamen europäischen digitalen Binnenmarkt haben. Nur dann können wir großen Mächten wie den USA oder auch China Paroli im besten Sinne des Wortes, im Sinne einer guten Konkurrenz auch darstellen. Wir nutzen derzeit dafür in der Tat natürlich auch den Neustart Europas. Nach den Europawahlen mit der Bildung der neuen Kommission bis Ende des Jahres treten wir in einen neuen europäischen Strategiezyklus ein. Und das ist eine große Chance, den wir nutzen müssen. Bundesminister Dr. Wissing hat Ende letzten Jahres mit den baltischen Staaten, die da großes Interesse hatten, Estland, Lettland, Litauen, einen sogenannten Innovationsclub gegründet und gemeinsam ein Papier entwickelt mit Forderungen an die künftige oder jetzt in Amt kommende neue Europäische Kommission, um wirklich eine innovationsfreundlichere Regulierung oder Rahmenbedingungen auf den Weg zu bringen. Nicht so viel Regulierung, sondern auch Innovationen zu ermöglichen. Dieses Papier haben wir natürlich an die Europäische Kommission übermittelt und viele Länder, EU-Länder sagen inzwischen jawohl, das geht in die richtige Richtung, chancenorientiert, innovationsfreundlich und auch pragmatisch. Das ist, glaube ich, der Ansatz, den wir in der Tat brauchen. Und natürlich arbeiten wir, ich sagte es eingangs, mit den anderen Mitgliedstaaten auf europäischer Ebene sehr eng zusammen. Aber ich glaube, auch hier müssen wir noch ein bisschen drauflegen, ein bisschen die Zusammenarbeit intensivieren, um besagten europäischen Binnenmarkt zu vollenden. Künstliche Intelligenz ist international und damit auch natürlich nicht auf Europa beschränkt. Auch deswegen ist es wichtig, dass wir unsere europäischen Wertvorstellungen im Bereich KI auch in die internationale Diskussion bringen und sie nicht nur bei uns behalten. Deswegen ist das Thema künstliche Intelligenz auch ein wichtiges Thema der G7 gewesen und hier auch in der Tat angetrieben von der Europäischen Kommission, von Frankreich, von Deutschland. Und wir haben immerhin es geschafft, jetzt den sogenannten Hiroshima Code of Conduct unter japanischer Präsidentschaft der G7 auf den Weg zu bringen. Und hier hat die EU intensiv mitgewirkt, die EU-Mitgliedsländer in den G7, dass man hier gute Leitplanken sichern kann. Wir wollen damit, dass KI-Entwickler dort, wo es keine Regulierung gibt, sich freiwillig zu bestimmten Dingen verpflichten. G7, 7 Staaten haben damit begonnen. Über 50 Staaten haben sich diesem Code of Conduct inzwischen angeschlossen. Und es werden immer mehr. China und Russland werden nicht dazugehören, aber es werden immer mehr, umso wichtiger, dass wir auch die Chancen, die deutsche, europäische Unternehmen im KI-Bereich haben, in möglichst viele Teile dieser Welt bringen können. Und wir dürfen auch nicht bei abstrakten Zielsetzungen bleiben, sondern müssen das Ganze wirklich sehr konkret machen. Wir arbeiten deswegen im G7-Kreis auch aktuell mit der OECD zusammen, um die freiwillige Umsetzung durch KI-Entwickler nicht nur mit Worten zu versehen, sondern mit Taten auch tatsächlich umzusetzen. Und ich bin vor dem Hintergrund auch sehr froh, dass wir nicht zu viele Strukturen haben, dass die OECD kürzlich die GPAI, also Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence, in ihre Strukturen integriert hat. Kanada und Frankreich waren da ja die Initiatoren dieses GPAIs. Es funktioniert gut, ist jetzt Teil der OECD und damit haben wir auch die Möglichkeit, über die OECD auch weitere Mitglieder, auch Nicht-OECD-Mitglieder anzusprechen. Das ist das klare Ziel, um hier möglichst viele Nationen auf die gleiche Linie zu bringen. Und es freut mich natürlich ganz besonders, dass wir bei all diesen Initiativen in der Vergangenheit und Herr Botschafter, ich bin davon überzeugt, auch in Zukunft mit unseren beiden Ländern eng zusammenarbeiten werden. Bin jetzt seit gut 3 Jahren Digitalstaatssekretär in Deutschland mit den französischen Kollegen. Es waren dann zum Teil verschiedene, immer sehr gut praktiziert. Wir werden das auch in Zukunft so tun. Wir werden bei diesen und auch bei vielen anderen Initiativen mit unseren französischen Freunden eng zusammenarbeiten, auf europäischer Ebene, im G7-Kreis, im OECD-Kreis, übrigens auch im G20-Kreis, wo es natürlich umso schwieriger wird. Aber ich bin zuversichtlich, freue mich auch auf den Input, den die heutige Diskussion hier nochmal mitgeben werden. Nochmals ganz herzlichen Dank, Herr Botschafter, für Ihre Einladung und Ihnen allen spannende Diskussionen, viele Inputs, von denen wir dann nachher auch profitieren können. Danke Ihnen vielmals.
So, I don't know. How long do I have to speak, to intervene? Can someone give me some guidance? How long am I supposed to speak? I don't know. I don't understand a word of what's going on here. Is there a chairman of the meeting? 10 minutes. Okay, good. There is something called share. I can speak 10 minutes. Very good. Thank you. Okay, let me share my screen. Hello, 1 second. 1 second. Let me share my screen there. Oh. 1 second. Share screen. Okay. So I only have 10 minutes. So just thank you for inviting me. As was very kindly mentioned by the ambassador, I had the chance of co-chairing the Commission on Artificial Intelligence with Anne Bouvreau, and we produced this report, AI, Our Ambition for France, which we handed over to President Macron in March 2024, last March. I just want to be very brief and just say a few things. Since I only have 10 minutes, I didn't know how long I would have. I will not just recall what AI is all about, but all what I could say is that the AI revolution affects all domains of activity, the economy, public services, the organization of work, media, culture, and it represents an acceleration, the generative AI, by simplifying the use of certain tools to the extreme. And the generative AI generates text, images, sounds at an extraordinarily high speed and with a stunning degree of realism. Just to give you an idea, it took 2.5 years for Netflix to reach 1 million users. It took 2.5 months for Instagram to reach 1 million users. And it took only 5 days for ChatGPT to reach 1 million users. Now, of course, this revolution creates both hopes and fears. The hope is that it would speed up growth, and the fear is that it would create mass unemployment. In fact, what I will argue is that there is a big growth potential of AI, but there is also an employment potential of AI, provided we put the right institutions. So just on growth, in fact, why does AI boost productivity growth? Because it will automate some tasks, both in the production of goods and services and in the production of ideas. It will make innovation technology more efficient. Okay, just in particular, why is it that AI facilitates the production of ideas? Because it helps find solutions to complex problems, it facilitates imitation and learning, and it can become self-improving. Okay, I just want to give you an idea. If you extrapolate from previous technological revolutions, electricity, IT, or if you adopt a task-based approach where you look at the tasks and you look in detail which tasks are likely to be performed by AI, and to which extent would that improve the productivity of labor, whether if you do the extrapolation method, you try to say if it would be like the previous revolutions, you anticipate an increase in productivity growth of between 0.8 percentage point for 10 years and 1.3. But that's not taking into account the fact that AI also automates the production of ideas. So that represents a lot. It means that you would induce an increase in France, for example, GDP between 250 and 400 billions by 2034. So in fact, you can see here, without the AI, you would have the dotted curve. With the AI, the growth rate of GDP per capita would increase by something between 0.8 and 1.3, and it would give you something like this. You can adopt another approach, which is to use a task-based approach, is to say, well, you know, it all depends which share of tasks are exposed to AI, which share of those tasks is AI truly profitable, what is the labor cost saving enabled by AI on those tasks, and what is the labor share adjusted for AI exposure. And if our own calculation is that, in fact, I don't want to go into the detail, but our own calculation is that a very reasonable estimate is that if we take the task-based approach, we should anticipate that AI for 10 years would increase productivity growth by 0.7 percentage points. I mean, if you have a 1% growth rate of GDP per capita, you will have a 1.7 growth rate, which is a lot, actually. If you take the extrapolation method, it's between 0.8 and 1.2. But at the minimum, it's a 0.7. So you get this figure. You see, if you have no AI, you have the dotted curve. If you have the AI, you get the red curve, and then you get back to the growth rate without. But here is not taking into account the fact that AI also automates partly the production of ideas. And if you take that into account, you get the blue curve. That means already you have a bigger growth rate in the next 10 years, but also permanently rate than if you had no AI. So that means that overall, AI has a big growth potential. The problem with AI is the lack of competition. That can be a problem. If you look at the rate of growth of per capita GDP, average yearly rate of growth of TFP in the US, it went up a lot between 1995 2005. That was the diffusion of the IT revolution. And but then you can see that the growth rate of TFP average annual went down a lot since the 2005 in the US. And in fact, what happened, and that's particularly true, this upsurge followed by decline in the sectors that are IT producing, which is the black curve, and IT using, which is the gray curve. And in fact, what happened is that with the IT, you had the emergence of superstar firms, Google, Walmart, Microsoft, Amazon. They first pushed the growth rate in the US because they were better organized. They took good advantage of the IT revolution. But through unlimited merger and acquisition, they became pervasive, and they ended up inhibiting entry of new firms. And you can see here the rate of entry of firms of all sizes in the US starts going down in the early 2000s. So the problem with the IT revolution is that because competition policy did not adapt to the revolution, you had the emergence of these tentacular large firms, and they ended up inhibiting entry of new potential innovators. And that had a kind of, dumping, mitigating effect on the growth rate of per capita GDP in the US. The problem with AI is that right away in the upstream segment of the AI value chain, in particular the cloud, you have already the large firms dominating. The same large Google, Microsoft, those guys already dominate. So the important conclusion here is that AI has a big growth potential, but you need to adapt our institutions and in particular competition policy so that you avoid what happened with IT. And that's why, DMA, the Digital Market Act, must be extended to include the cloud, in particular, to all the segments of the AI value chain should the DMI, the Digital Market Act apply. Also very important to have open access to data and open source. We believe that all those guys are very important to guarantee that there is competition and that AI revolution will not stifle competition like the IT revolution ended up stifling competition, okay? So that's what we say, okay? AI has a growth potential which is high, but inappropriate competition policy may hamper it. In particular, the cloud is dominated by 3 superstar firms, and you have only one big actor, GPU, on the market for graphic processors. So that has to be dealt with. And current competition policy in Europe is very good, but has to be improved to deal with that, okay? Now, I want to say just a few words on AI and employment. I have some of my colleagues in the US in particular that they believe AI is very bad for employment. But in fact, in joint work with colleagues in France, we have looked at French firms that adopt AI, compared employment in those firms with the evolution of employment in similar firms that did not adopt AI between 2019 and 2021. And what we find is that overall, firms that adopt AI, they increase employment. Or you might find that paradoxical, because you would say, well, no, AI should replace manpower and therefore should reduce employment. It's true you have partly substitution, and what I said before is that AI automates partly tasks in the production of goods and services. But the thing is that firms that adopt AI, they become more productive, therefore more competitive, therefore they have a better quality price ratio, and therefore they increase the world market for their product, and therefore they increase the demand for their product, and therefore they increase employment. Alors, it's not uniform. For example, administrative and commercial intermediate profession like executive secretary, those jobs tend to be, employment there tend to be negatively affected by AI, okay? And but overall, AI has a positive potential on employment. Now, there's been a parallel study by the International Labour Office, and they decomposed jobs in tasks. There are tasks that have small replacement risk. They put a small score, tasks with medium replacement risk, and tasks with high replacement risk. And here you can look at this, it comes from that ILO study. On the upper panel, I have the managerial jobs. The managerial jobs, most of the tasks are, so each line is a job. And here I rank the task from those that are least replaced by AI to those that are most likely to be replaced by AI. And you see managerial job, most of the tasks are in the dark blue, purple, which is no replacement, but they have a few tasks that are replaced, which is ideal because in fact you want some tasks that are the boring tasks to be replaced by AI so that you can devote more time to more creative tasks. And for managerial jobs, you see that overall AI is a very good news because it replaces some of the tasks which are the boring tasks, and you can devote more time to the more creative tasks. But for example, for clerical support workers, it's the other way around. You see AI replace most tasks. So you see the danger there that those jobs here typically are threatened to disappear. And we ranked jobs in France. On the vertical axis is the degree of exposition to AI of the job, and the more to the left you are, the higher the share of tasks that are likely to be replaced, or the lower the share of tasks that are unlikely to be replaced. The jobs that are most at risk are those that are most exposed to AI, and where a larger share of the tasks that compose the job are likely to be replaced by AI, like accountant, remote sale, secretary. Those are the jobs that are very much at risk of being replaced. And you can start from those jobs, accountant, remote sale, and secretary. Those are likely to be replaced. But as soon as you get to there, the job is preserved. Many of the tasks will be replaced, but still the job overall will be maintained. And you see that only the 0.2 this 20% of jobs are at risk of replacement, and there you need a very good labor market to deal with that. So overall, we believe that there is no existential risk of AI. AI will not generate mass unemployment. There will be only a small fraction of jobs for which most of the tasks are likely to be replaced. Most of the other jobs will be preserved, but still on those jobs you need to retrain. So you need appropriate institutions to help retrain workers and adapt to the AI revolution. So that means that you need a very good education system, because at school you learn to learn. And then you need a good, training and unemployment insurance system to help workers retrain and move from one job to another job. Denmark, for me, is a very good system of labor market. They have a very good education system in Denmark and a very good flex security system on the labor market. So overall, you see, we should not fear the AI revolution. The AI revolution has high growth and employment potential, but we need to adapt institutions and policies to succeed the transition to AI economy. So we need a good, adequate competition policy for AI to deliver on its growth potential, and we need adequate education and labor market institutions in order for AI to fully deliver on its employment creation potential. Okay, so now last word, the French report, the view was to say competition is important. You need AI, it's data and computing power. For data, and you need competition. So it's very important to have competition, because competition, maximizes the growth potential of AI. You need good access to data, because data is the big input to the AI revolution. So anything that would prevent access to data, it's a problem, it's an impediment to AI delivering on growth and unemployment. So you need competition and access to data on the one hand, but we also need industrial policy to develop our computing power. We cannot just rely on the US for computing power. It's very important that Europe also has its industrial policy, but I am in favor of a pro-competition industrial policy. The problem is, why is it that the US do much more breakthrough innovations in general than Europe? Because in the US, they have a much better organized and financed basic research system with universities, foundations, and private donors. So that they have a fantastic ecosystem for basic research, much better than we have in Europe. Second, they have a very good financial system with a well-developed venture capital market and institutional investors, much more than we have in Europe. And they have the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency type of organization, the ARPA. They did the DARPA for defense and space. Then they created the ARPA Energy for energy. And then they have the BARDA, the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority for vaccines. And those are devices to do industrial policy in a way which is pro-entry and pro-competition. And in the US, they have those three: basic research, venture capital, institutional investors, and the DARPA, BARDA, ARPA Energy. And the Draghi report is all about how can we have in Europe anything that approximates this fantastic ecosystem to generate breakthrough innovation. In Europe, we mainly finance incremental innovations in automobile or in mobility, but we are very little, we don't do enough breakthrough innovation in the frontier areas: AI, biotech, software, And we need to be there. We need to be there because China is becoming also a big actor. And it's true, there is a big danger of a decline of Europe compared to the US and China. Of course, US is an ally, China is not. But still, even though we are allies with the US, we are also competing with the US. When they do the IRA, they do not consult with us. They decide to do the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act. We need in Europe to put in place all the instruments for generating breakthrough innovation, in particular, to not miss the AI revolution. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bon après-midi, bienvenue au Dialogue Paris-Platz. I will switch to English for the ease for the interpreters. Welcome. What Philippe Aghion didn't mention now is in his report he wrote, we shouldn't be pessimistic, we shouldn't be too optimistic either. We should find the right approach to AI. And this is what we're going to do in the upcoming 2 panels. My name is Silke Vetter. I'm an EU correspondent in Brussels. And before I will invite the panelists up on stage here, I would just like to make 2 practical announcements. I've been told, and I've tested it, I think it seems to work. Wi-Fi is back. There is Wi-Fi, if you look for it, Krasik test. And the password is Krasik, C-R-A-S-I-C, 4 as a number 4, and then ever. So it should work forever. We hope it'll last at least this afternoon. And the other announcement, C-R-A-S-I-C, in German as well, C-R-A-S-I-C, 4 as a number 4, and ever, E-V-E-R. Is it working? It did work when I tried to do it, so it should. Oh yeah, there is someone holding it up. That might be easier if you come to the front so that people can see it. And I have also been told that there is a slight delay when you're listening to the translation. So bear with us. But I think we might have the discussion mostly in English, which is easier. Yeah, but the interpretation has that there's a problem. There's a slight delay. That's what I was trying to explain. Without much further ado, I would like to invite the panelists for the first panel on stage, and I know there's someone who wants to leave earlier, so I'd really love us to move on. So, Madame la Sénatrice, Yeah, we're running a little late, so some people might leave earlier, but I'm sure we're going to have a very interesting discussion nevertheless. Let me introduce this high-profile panel. You had the furthest trip from Paris. I'm delighted to have Madame la Sénatrice here, Corinne Narassiguin. You're a senator, you're a rapporteur of the Parliamentary Office for the Evaluation of Scientific and Technological Choices, OPEX in French. You also have a really interesting professional background in IT, which is unusual for politicians, so I'm twice as delighted to have you here. Joanna Bryson, professor at the Hertie School. You have also a very sound background in AI. Delighted to have you here, and you're one of the ones who have to dash off. So I'll talk to you first. let me just introduce the rest of the panel. Mike Außendorf, you're a member of the German Parliament, and notably you are a coordinator for digital policy, and you also have a background in IT, which is brilliant. We have another expert we've got from Paris, Professor Frédéric Pascal. You're the director of Data IA. I hope I pronounce it properly. It looks quite something when you look at it. And this institution is part of Centrale Supélec. And last but not least, we've got Professor Gesche Joost here. I'm really pleased that we have you here because in 1 month's time you'll be the president of the Goethe Institute. You'll probably also do something along Franco-German lines, but also German and the rest of the world. And you are a director at the German Institute for AI. So another expert. Joanna, before you dash off, because you're looking at your watch, I would like to hear your point of view. The Draghi report was really sounding a very loud alarm bell, saying this is an existential challenge. This is huge, and Europe could literally go under. He was saying politicians so far, they haven't been doing a great job. The gap, especially when we look at China, when we look at when we look at the US even more so, is just terrifying. What's your view on that, if we do some stock taking?
So thank you very much. It's a real honor to be here. I was promised I'd be here from 3 o'clock until 3:40 when I have to leave. I realize that right now we're in France, but I'm teaching in Germany in like 15 minutes. So I'm only staying here for 5 minutes. So forgive me for taking maybe my first and my second turn at the same time to talk about this. I mean, I find it really bizarre that the previous head of Director General of Competition did an analysis based only on companies that were worth 200 billion euros. I mean, that, as we just heard, absolutely brilliantly explained. One of the biggest problems we're seeing in this area is market concentration. And I would say this was not just about IT. This is about the Chicago school. I am from Chicago, but nevertheless, the misapplication of antitrust that we've been seeing from right in the middle of the Microsoft case, right? So, but innovated about the time that the Soviet Union economy plateaued, sorry. Suddenly the Americans thought, oh, it doesn't matter if we redistribute or not, and that's false, right? It just hasn't worked. And regulation is essential for innovation. It is through regulation that we maintain markets and we get money to the right people. I agree with some of the points about like we need to make sure that there's adequate finance. That's a little too hard to start up companies, especially it depends on the state you're in Germany, how hard it is to start up a company. What sense is that, right? You know, so I get that there are some things that need to be done. But I just want to kind of bash through a couple other points. If we're thinking about who has really lost jobs because of AI, let me tell you, one of the #1 people, journalists. Right? And it's not because we replaced them, it's because we allowed Google and Facebook to take all the advertising revenue, right? So, you know, and this is a threat to our democracy. You can laugh, but this is, you know, when we're talking about this, so I just saw these numbers about like, how are we replacing? Look, when you have AI, see now this is my phone, so I'm gonna miss my beginning of my own class. If you look at the clerks, becoming hyper-productive, people are going to hire more clerks. There's going to be fewer managers because they're not becoming more productive and they're becoming relatively more expensive. So the employment impacts there could be on the opposite. You know, there's a famous thing, David Autor made it famous, but James Besson, who also has data, and so does Christian Dustman, similar to the French data we just saw, and for the Netherlands and for Germany. But anyway, in terms of the stuff about the strength of the companies who are employing AI and the fact that they're able to expand employment and retain and actually increase the salaries of their workers. But anyway, one of the famous first examples of this was actually ATMs. When you brought in the automated teller machine, then there were actually more clerks, not fewer, but that was because there were more branches. Because branches were less expensive, because you only needed a couple of clerks and no managers, right? Because there's only like 2 clerks. So that was, So anyway, it's complicated. Speaking of Besson, again, he wrote a new book called The New Goliaths, where he basically shows that in every sector, this is not special to IT, it's not special to AI. In every sector, the use of software, the use of AI solves logistics, and then they wind up being able to, whoever spends the most on software becomes a natural monopoly without the problems of logistics. So really, we need to figure out what to do about market concentration. I suspect this is a transnational problem. That's part of the problem, is because these companies are transnational, so no government, even the United States, can't regulate them. Anyway, the main answer I thought I was going to give you was that I wrote a paper with Helena Malikova, yes, she of the Apple case, but she works in the Director General of Competition several years ago, showing that the European innovation, if measured in WIPO IP, so not looking at the biggest companies, but rather looking at any company that's publishing AI, publishing AI patents, and then seeing what is the market capital of those companies, then we are absolutely comparable with China. And actually, so that's a published paper. I have more recent papers showing that we're coming up because China is being impacted by the trade things here. So, Europe, not only Europe and China, but the rest of the world outside of the U.S. is also doing extremely strong, particularly Japan, but a lot of countries. So I think that everything that says that, oh, our regulations are getting in the way is mistaken. There's been some fantastic reports recently, and I was not allowed to bring slides, but I would love to show you the reports about the GDPR, the area. We are doing extremely well. In fact, last year, 2023, was the first year that there were more people in tech moving from the US to the EU than the other way around. So yeah, anyway, that's my opinion. I'm sorry to run, but I can now be on the second panel. If you keep going this slow, then I'll be back in time. I'll come back. My class ends at 6, so I'll be back at the end. So.
Thank you very much. Indeed, it would be great to have you back for the second panel, because I think we're going to touch on some of the other points, and it's a pity we can't react. Well, you can react to her, but she won't be able to come back to you. Madame la Sénatrice, if we do some stock taking, how challenging is the situation? Is there a gap Europe can still close, or are we too late to the game?
Well, I'm not sure. It depends on the perspective that we're taking. I think if we're talking about building a direct competitor to OpenAI or Google with Gemini, it's going to be difficult. But there are other areas where we can become more competitive and take the lead based on our strength as European countries. And I think the fact that we have the AI Act coming up and the regulations, the European regulations, we have to take the lead in what we would call safe AI, trustworthy AI, because it can become our label. The fact that European AI is trustworthy AI, I think that's an area where we can become leaders compared to the US, where even though they understand also that there is a need for regulation, President Biden issued an executive order, and there is some movement in California in terms of legislation. So they understand the need for regulation, but it always will be much later, and it always will be under the pressure of the big techs, the big American techs. So we have to take the lead in terms of producing AI for good, in terms of ethical AI, in terms of AI where we also think about things like the impact on society on children, for example. We have no idea what it means to raise a child that is interacting with AI from a very early age. So there's a lot of research there that should be going on. There's a lot of research, a lot of investment that we need, and we need to become much better in investing private and public money into research in very different areas, not just, of course, software infrastructure, and I guess we can talk more about that, but also in social studies. This is something that where we can take the lead because of the AI Act and the fact that the AI Act is going to establish based on use cases what is risky, what is acceptable risk, and what is not, and what the processes are for deciding what is safe AI or not. And this is the challenge: is how we impose our regulations, our standards on the rest of the world. And then if we do that, then we can take the lead in some areas.
Thank you very much. We'll come back to the investment argument because it's really, really important. Mike Ossendorf, what's your evaluation of the current situation?
A little bit different, maybe. I agree completely with you that we have a big advantage as a first mover regarding regulation. I see this as a big competition advantage compared to other regions of the world, because we have clear conditions. Companies know under which regulative framework they act, and they can be safe that it will be this way the next years. And we also see that's interesting in the United States that some of the states started to have a legislation about AI regulation. And those, I think it's 15 states right now, or 16, companies see those states that have a clear regulation as an advantage to invest there for the same reason that I've already mentioned, that is competitiveness, that is clearness of regulation, so they can rely on something. We have a big problem with what Staatssekretär Schnorr called AI ecosystem. I would break it down to AI infrastructure. And that's not new to the AI issue. We saw this market concentration, which Joanna mentioned, for a long time. We have the big 4 companies in the US, and when it comes to cloud services, and in the end, AI will be a special kind of cloud service, well, very power consumption, but it's still a cloud service in most of the cases. So we now see this problem become clearer and more obvious that there is a problem. So we have dependency on intercontinental connections. We have the problem that you simply cannot, or it's not legal to submit personal data to US data centers, which a lot of companies and public administration, I heard the EU Commission itself by themselves are doing it, reaching their own rules. So this is a big problem, and we should really concentrate on setting up an European AI infrastructure, which could be the French-German base, but shouldn't be limited to it. And there are already some mid-sized companies that offer these kind of services from France, from Germany, and we should do everything to make their life easier, to make them to offer services to the public, to companies that can then, in accordance with data security regulations, in accordance with AI Act, in a safe environment, do their AI business things. So that's really something that we should concentrate on.
Frédéric Pascal, how do you see the current situation? What's our starting point?
So first, thank you for the invitation. And just to precise, the Data Institute is from University Paris-Saclay, but Centrale Supélec is part of this big ecosystem. So I agree on the regulation aspect. That is a very good advantage for Europe. Something I want to mention that is essential when we talk about AI is the training aspect. So it has been mentioned, upgrading skills for already employed people, but the training aspects are essential. Even in this room, if we ask for what is Gen AI, how it works, I mean, just the basics, a big picture, something that some kids can understand. I'm not sure that many people know. I don't have to ask who is an expert in Gen AI. But this is a fundamental aspect for, we talk about ethical AI, safe AI. We have to understand, I mean, a lot of people don't know what is Gen AI. Some people say even, I mean, educated people say that Gen AI is just a system that is very, very faster on internet to grab the information. I mean, that's, so I think in Europe, we are very good at talent training. The next step is to keep the talent. So, of course, some talents come back to Europe from the US. I mean, there are some explanation about that. For instance, one company called Meta employed people for 4 years, and after they can have some money if they leave, but they have to stay 4 years. So young people come back to Europe. But training is the first aspect, and also when talking about trustworthy AI, we are talking about mathematics. This is essential. How to explain the system, how to evaluate bias of the system. This is partly mathematics. So we have to focus also on developing competence in mathematics. So training is for me something essential, but not only talents training for all the society. People have to know what is AI to avoid what happens with a numerical transition. I mean, some people stay a part of this transition.
But you would say universities in Europe are already doing a good job when it comes to training future AI experts. We're on par with the best of the world.
Yeah, but we have to keep people after. And also, it's not enough. That's why, so in France, there's been a lot of investment for training more and more data scientists, data engineers. So we need to have more talent, but I mean, it's essential to keep talents, to create a startup, to create this ecosystem, because of course, we cannot compete with Google Gemini.
How do we do it? How do we keep them?
I mean, there's many solutions. The context, the working context, the ecosystem, the innovation ecosystem is one answer. Of course, salaries are another answer, but there's a different way to do that. And also, I mean, being leader in Europe is another option. If everybody knows that Europe is the continent for AI, of course, people will stay. Hopes that.
If you're sexy, people will be attracted to you, basically,
Yes.
you're saying.
Geesche Joost, what's your evaluation of the current situation?
Yeah, I will partly disagree, so that we get a bit of tension here to the panel. In terms of the regulation, would be a competitive advantage. So maybe I will start with one anecdote. So I was traveling to China and just shortly before the pandemic hit, and I was visiting Didi. So that's the Chinese pendant to Uber. So kind of great, a really big mobility provider, and they do kind of incredible stuff because they have all the mobility data of kind of. Let's generalize it with all Chinese people who are using Didi. So they were able to control the Shanghai traffic system. A private company was controlling the Shanghai traffic system, so that's how China does it. But they do, and they were able to reduce the traffic jam by 20%. And they were just kind of, doing amazing stuff with AI, with mobility data. And I was asking them, how, do you approach the European market? What about data privacy, and what about, regulations? Or how do you see this? And they just said, either we find a way through, whatever that means, or we just leave out the European market. So there was their, perception of, okay, there's this thing Europe, but, I don't really care. Now the same thing is happening here, right? So just today we have kind of Meta is a bit attacking the European regulation and Margrethe Vestager and saying, it's just too complicated and we don't launch the Meta AI assistant here, and that's your fault. That's basically their assumption, saying, here's not the place for having the best technology that we can offer, so we just don't launch it. So, from this angle, we could say regulation is too complicated, and also companies here in Germany, they are really having hard times in interpreting the AI Act, interpreting the EU regulation, what it really means to be compliant, and how they can take the first steps in using AI. So they are not developing AI in general, but using AI. So we are more the user generation, not the developer generation. So that's really a big challenge. And they are even then, so just using whatever, Copilot from Microsoft or something, they have to check whether it's worth the investment and whether it's kind of compliant to their data privacy regulation. So it's really tough for everybody. So we could argue regulation is needed, but today it's too complicated, and we are very late in being part of the game.
Better regulation is needed, basically. That's what you're saying, regulation, but
yes,
better.
simpler and agile. So it has to also, not just, AI Act was developed when when ChatGPT was not on the market yet, and that it was launched, and it's kind of maybe in a bit also outdated already. It needs to, evolve very quickly and be very, very simple.
Faster regulation also, because I think you're alluding to something that's really important, that the processes in Brussels especially are slower at least than technological progress, and it's something that is really, really hard to solve. I'm really glad you mentioned Meta, and it's something I would like to ask anyone who would like to comment on that, because we don't only have Meta, we also have Apple. We see more and more cases where companies say, well, we're just going to avoid the European market. And to me, it seems a bit like blackmail. So first, who wants to go first? You go first.
Okay, so first I was triggered by your statement regarding China. I mean, China cannot be the benchmark for us when we talk about regulation. They are doing medical experiments on sentenced people, so that cannot be the benchmark, not at all. And of course, if you don't have any kind of regulation, you can do more amazing stuff, but not only amazing, but also terrifying stuff. So we should compare to other regions that are based on human rights, on common values, and there we are first movers. Okay, it takes a long time to make laws in the Bundestag and in Europe, but again, the EU is the first major economic region that has a regulation, so that is still a big advantage. Then you said something about we cannot compete with Gemini, ChatGPT, if I got it right. I think there is a way. So first, I said before, we need an AI infrastructure, so big data centers where that we have the physical power. And then we could and we should use open source for several reasons. There are some really advanced open source models that could beat Gemini and ChatGPT in some comparison benchmarks. And if we make use of those open source models and then use where we are good at, we have a lot of talented young people coming from university, having studied mathematics, computer science, any other natural science, and they could really work on AI, open source models, make them better and suit them to use here for economy, for public administration, and so on. And this is something we should focus on, use our strength and expand it and make use of it.
Yes, coming back to the Meta or Apple and their attitude, I think it's it's playing politics, I think, a little bit with us. Obviously, they're putting pressure because they know we are in the phase of implementing the AI Act. And it's true that the AI Act has its drawbacks because it was devised before generative AI, and then they tacked on the part about generative AI at the end. But it's still, I think it's still generally a good framework because it's risk-based, it's use-based. And but the problem is we have an issue with explaining the black box, and as long as we don't really know how to do this, and that's why we need new generations of mathematicians. So that's another worry for our educational system in France. We may have some issues devising good processes for evaluating the risk, and I think that's where the big companies are putting pressure on us because they don't want us to put in place processes that are too complicated, that may change very quickly over time because the technology changes. So they need, just any company, they need predictability. They need to know where they're, what the landscape is going to be. And I think they're putting pressure on the EU's to make the implementation as loose, as flexible as possible. And I think obviously we can't completely we can't agree on all their demands, obviously, but we need to hear what they're saying in terms of, because it's also for our companies and our innovation, that the processes need to be clear and the processes need to be predictable, and that we need to be aware that the technology may change very quickly, and that the European Union may have to adapt also the AI Act much quicker than they think, because the cycle right now for revision is very long. I think it's 6 or 7 years, it's far too long. So we need to understand that. But I do agree that I don't think they're actually going to pull out of such a big market. But I do agree that we need to invest more in our infrastructures, our own supercomputer, our data infrastructures. We need to educate our companies and our public administration in using European infrastructure, because then we know that the data is going to be protected. Because right now, when you put your data in ChatGPT, you don't know what OpenAI will do with it. So this is really important also for our sovereignty, that we build our own, not just for competitivity, but for our sovereignty, that we build our own infrastructures, our AI factories, and that we push the research in processor innovation, and also but you could speak to this much better than I can in terms of hybridating the different AI models, because everybody's talking about generative AI now, but most of the actual application where we know there's a direct economic advantage are not generative AI today. So, and we need for our small businesses and even artisans and farmers and everybody to know that there are AI applications that can be used for them to do ecological transitions and better use water, better use energy, better use resources in general. So lots of application where if we have public backing, then it will be beneficial to the common good, and it will produce economic growth.
I think what you're saying basically is also that people will start trusting once they see that there is actually there are very useful applications out there, like the way journalists would use DeepL for translation. You know, I use it all the time and see how useful it is. If a farmer sees something that is equally useful, it'll speed up the uptake.
I think people use it actually already a lot for themselves, or not without telling their bosses that they're using it. But I think the problem is we need to make sure that they use it in a way that's safe, that where they know where the data is going, that they understand the risk also, because sometimes AI gives you wrong answers. There's bias. There are problems today still with AI, so people need to understand that it's not a magical tool. So they need to understand what they're using and how they can use it efficiently.
Yeah, maybe a comment. So of course, I would totally agree that what Meta does is a power play now. So that's part of the game. And if they would not react to our regulation, we would have done something wrong. We know if they just would say like, okay, so then we would have not hit the point. So I would totally agree. And so there's a kind of back and forth in shaping the regulation and putting it into place. But what we really have to face, I think, that we are not competitive towards OpenAI, for example, because the big game changer was not generative AI kind of in general or large language models, but it was the amount of data that they were putting into, training data into ChatGPT. That was the breakthrough. And this would never happen in Germany or in Europe. They took just the whole internet at the point in time in 2020 and just, were feeding it into the machine. And it's like, okay, so that's what's coming out. And that's maybe something that we really have to understand, that we don't do these things in Europe. So maybe now the second round of optimizing open source models to a specific purpose, I think that's where we can really play with on eye level, and optimizing and creating trust in having real kind of very specific applications and not kind of general purpose stuff, but really specific cases where we really implement also our values into the system. So I think that there's really a big potential. But what we need is that the excellent research that is happening in France, in Germany, in the whole European Union must be put into innovation. So I think, at least in Germany, we don't have the kind of whole process. We stop with the research when the kind of research results are done. We publish a paper and off we go. So that's really still the fact. And I know I come from research and I know how it goes. So we do also applied research, but we rarely really create startups. I mean, if we create a startup, then it's kind of two people, great tech vision that ends up in nothing. And so we don't, scale up and don't have those bold visions. So that's really something where we also in the French-German dialogue and collaboration, we really have to hit this point where we say we have applied research and we put this from end to end into marketable products, and we really have the whole process and all the incentives that we need. We have great salary, because that's really, we cannot compete with the current salary of our research. That's just ridiculous. So if you see what Google offers to you, then you can do the math. So it's really, we have to be very precise in putting this great stuff that we have really into products.
And Germany has a long record of not sort of getting research breakthroughs into marketable innovations or products. What's the situation like in France?
Yeah, just to react. I was not clear in the competition. I was talking about the company, not the model. For sure, the model, we know if we look at Hugging Face, a very good platform to compare the performance of the model. There are many models that perform better than ChatGPT or Llama, whatever. The question is the data, of course, because as you know, the model, you have small models, so a few number of parameters, and a few it's only million, and then big models, so billions of parameters. And for having all those parameters, we need ton of training data, and in that sense, we cannot compete with Google. I mean, even countries, they have tons of public data, but it's not enough. So it was this point on the company. And on the regulation, I think in Europe, we have something about trustworthy AI, about explainable AI, and for that, we need some regulation, and especially on the data, because I agree that the regulation is far too complicated, and it's very difficult for companies, even European companies. I talk with a Mistral CEO, and they say, no, we don't want to have that. But for having a reproducible AI, even the scientific communities, they need to know on which data the model has been trained. It was the first problem of the first version of ChatGPT. So it was on this point. I think on the data, making data available, this is essential. And okay, everything is not Gen AI, and so you mentioned that. I completely agree with that. And for, economical interest, there's, tons of other AI model that is not Gen AI is part of supervised learning. It's a very small part, but very easy to use. So that is something we have to take care that AI is not only Gen AI.
Thank you for reminding us that good regulation is even more important for small companies, because for big companies, easier to handle regulation. They'll have their own department. They can hire 5 or 10 people or even more. But for a small company, it's even more of a burden. I would like to come back to capital, because you raised the point, and I think it's vital. And just citing some figures from the Draghi report, who said that 61% of global funding for top AI went to US companies last year,
70% to China and 6% to EU. What do we do, especially given that we have a backdrop of really tight coffers everywhere? I mean, in France, there's a lot of worry how to design a budget this year. In Germany, the situation isn't rosy either. On the EU level, it's not rosy. So what do we do?
I'm not sure I should give my opinions on fiscal policies in this panel,
But on capital, you can talk something about the need how to track capital.
But yeah, I think that we have to understand where our priorities should be, because this is not public spending with no specific. I mean, it's not wasting money. It's investing money. It's investing in our future. It's investing in a lot of transitions that we absolutely need, and it's investing in a lot of economic opportunities, and it's also investing in our own sovereignty in terms of protecting, because there are existential risks to AI. So it's also investing in protecting ourselves. So I think we need to be much better than we are today in combining public and private investments. We don't do that very well. The US, people think the US, because it's the capitalistic country, right, that it's mostly private funds. It's not true. There's a lot of public money that goes into this type of research, this type of even product development, either through defense or directly through universities and all kinds of partnerships with private companies. And so we're really tiny compared to what the US are doing in terms of investments in cutting edge technologies. So we need to combine much better private and public spending and be smart about where we put our investments. So definitely infrastructure today, but also research for next gen breakthroughs, right? We don't know where the next breakthrough in processing is going to be. NVIDIA, they kind of fell on the GPU being the processor for AI, for generative AI, but we don't know what the next breakthrough is going to be in quantum computing or in biological computing or optical computing. We don't know. So we have to put also money in this kind of research, for example. And as I said, I think that's a lot less costly. We also need to put money in social sciences around the use of AI, around the impact in our society, and how we make sure that it's adopted properly by society. Because a lot of we need to learn from the lessons from the digital revolution and everything that we didn't predict in terms of impact on our daily lives, on our interactions as human beings, on democracy and information and the news cycles and everything. So AI is going to be much bigger than this. So we also have to be ready, and that's also useful investment, I think.
It's a very good point. Thank you very much. Prioritizing our expenditure, it sounds so easy, but you're part of a parliament where everyone thinks that their specific favorite topic is the number one priority. What do we do? How do we go ahead?
Well, one thing is I completely agree with you that we need more public-private money combinations. I mean, we have good programs from the government for founding companies, for startups. It's called Exist in Germany. But we all know that for the scale-up phase, when a product has become major and it needs money to scale up into larger markets, there's the lack. And so we have paid education for the people, university, the founding process, the startup process, and then when the company becomes major and needs more capital to really go high, people in the Silicon Valley are just waiting and pick them up, and then they are gone. And so we have paid everything until that point, and then someone else gets the fruits. So what can we do additionally? One thing you said, more public-private money, funding, leveraging thing. And one problem that we have in Europe is, especially in Germany, that public funds, that pension funds are not allowed to invest into risky things like startups usually are, while American funds do have less restrictions. So the lesson is that we need a good regulation. Of course, we don't want to open all pension funds to spend 100% of their money in startups. No, that's not, but it could help to just open it to have a low percentage to allow them to spend a part of their multi-billion portfolio into startups. And I guess this way we could raise a lot of money here in Germany and Europe. And now I have to apologize. I had 4:15 in my schedule, and I've booked a train, and intermittently, even in Germany, they arrive on time, and I don't want to miss it. So have a good time here. Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming. Thanks for joining us this afternoon. I'm not sure whether either of you would like to add anything on capital. Otherwise, I would like to open the last round. Maybe you can do capital and the last round, which would be, what would be your advice in terms of Franco-German initiatives? What could be done jointly, and what would have an amazing amount of additional value to Europe and all of us?
It's an interesting panel, so we are the last people sitting here, so that, leaves more time for us to discuss. So I think in terms of also the next chapter, and also where we have to put our capital in, so I think that research collaborations in France and in Germany, so there are very good examples with INRIA, for example, and with DFKI, so with my institution, but other initiatives. So I think that there the right people come together, so to invest in some, so not many, so some of kind of really major research collaborations is, I think, a very good point. And then taking all the journey up to the point where it hits the market. I've been also recently to Singapore, and they had a kind of state-financed, in a way, a design agency. That was quite interesting. So they took first kind of prototypes from research, and they were kind of holding hand until the product hits the market. So they really developed together with research institutions and with kind of with entrepreneurs the way for products and services, and were in a way a company builder. And maybe that's not possible for in the same kind of style on the European level, but thinking along these lines. So what is missing, that these kind of research collaborations and the really excellent research results, I think they're really world class. So that no doubt that we don't have the capacity there. But what does it take until we really are funding these kind of startup companies and really make kind of big bets? I think that this is mind shift change. It's a capital question, but also thinking in the process. So really from end to end. So I think that this would be a good advice for strengthening the research, collaboration, and innovation capacity.
Frédéric Pascal, what would you want to see on what's on your Franco-German wish list?
So I agree with those type of investment on very specific research topics. So it already works because I was in RIA. So that's a very good point. I think something that could be also very interesting is to have a common infrastructure, because for the moment, each country has its own kind of national infrastructure for computational resources. It's something that could help researchers to work together. I mean, the topic, the funding for research project, but also having access to European infrastructure.
And what's on your Franco? I need to get my
Yes,
mic.
I agree. So I won't expand on what they already said, but more maybe on the political level, I think, especially with the AI summit that's coming up in France, I think the collaboration between France and Germany has to strengthen. It's already strong, and it needs to strengthen in this area. Echoing what Mr. Ambassador said earlier, I think we need to use the very long history of France and Germany of working together to push Europe forward, to pushing it forward in terms of European sovereignty, industrial sovereignty, and also safety for development of AI. And I think that's really a question of political will to really push cooperation, starting with France and Germany, but pushing for larger cooperation throughout the EU in terms of research. And I was a few months ago, I was in the Netherlands, and they have a very thriving AI scene over there. And obviously, they are very international already. And so we need this to be, we need all of these tissue networks to be really interconnected, and we need to have governments that push in the same direction for investing in I wouldn't say necessarily big. I don't think that we can build like we built Airbus, suddenly a big industrial champion. But we need to build a European ecosystem. And it can be big companies, it can be very small companies, it can be a mix of all of this. It needs to be a full ecosystem that mixes research, because the research will always be necessary, because it's something that evolves very rapidly, and so the interconnection between our research centers and our economic system that needs to be much more interconnected at European level, and we need to be collaborating and strategizing together, which we don't do today, I think.
Thank you very much. I'd like to open the floor for your questions, and maybe we've had some questions online. Any questions? Yes, please. And if you'd be so kind as to present yourself and keep the question short and to the point.
Of course. Hello. Bien, merci beaucoup à toutes et tous. And vielen Dank für Ihre Erläuterung. My question goes, so first of all, I'm Marika Peterson. I'm currently unaffiliated, but very interested in the topic. And my question goes towards energy, because AI is extremely in need of much energy to be working, to be functioning, etc. And we've just had the news that Microsoft is planning on reviving a very critical nuclear power station in the US in order to build enough energy resources. And looking at the Green Deal, etc., and the green transition in Europe, how can we build a network that can support our needs in energy for AI? Thank you.
And I'm going to collect a couple of questions. If we have more questions, yes, please.
Hello, thank you. My name is Amino Slati. I'm an AI governance researcher at the Future Society in Brussels, and we are involved a lot in the code of practice for general purpose AI being developed in EU right now. And I have a demand and a question for Ms. Joost. The demand is, I think we should be more precise in what we criticize about regulation. For example, in the AI Act, we are right now only making the rules that should govern general purpose AI, the most risky, the largest systemic AI models. The regulation we're only writing right now, we are part in these working groups, and I think we should be precise what we think is a problem. For example, being that in the AI office, we're still only 10 employees, rather than maybe 50 or to 100. So I think we should be clear what we think the problems are. And my question is, why this obsession with building European general purpose AI models? Because I'm still not understanding where the economic gain comes from having a company like OpenAI with 1,000 employees, those becoming millionaires, but I don't see the widespread gains from that. Why don't we focus more on downstream applications for economic benefits?
Do we have a third question?
Yes, I don't know if you hear me.
No, then please, would you like to start?
Yeah, maybe to the first question. So I think the energy, the CO2 footprint is really a major challenge. And so what we see so far is when we come to smaller, specifically trained open source models, they have a much smaller CO2 footprint. And so I guess that for us on a European level, this is anyhow the innovation target that we should address. So kind of specified models, not the big general purpose ones. And then it's better also for the CO2 footprint. And I think that there's also kind of research and innovation capacity in bringing this together. So the sustainability agenda with the innovation and AI agenda. So I think that this is exactly what you're saying. So having kind of an alignment of these two goals that we have. The second kind of your criticism, I just didn't get it. So I think that this is just a kind of reflection, what I hear from companies and what I see currently in the power play of Meta and other ones. And I think that it's fair to say that it's difficult for the companies currently to understand how they put it into practice. And this is, I think, valuable command. So I don't see any adjustment, whether this is too critical to state this.
Yeah, on the first question on energy for AI, so it has been mentioned. There's a move to hybrid AI model, so meaning having this foundation model, so very big model, and combining knowledge, involving knowledge inside, and I mean, adding knowledge, there's no computational cost. So yeah, that's my personal opinion, but we'll go to a plateau. So those bigger and bigger model, it will stop. I mean, it's in a sense completely stupid in terms of energy. Now the performance are very good because we are talking about not only LLMs but foundation models, so with images, videos, and so on. So now the performance are good. There's no need to go further in terms of performance. The only need to go further is to destroy the planet. So I think it will stop at some point. And on the second question, actually I agree that there's no need to create a European GPT model. I completely agree with that. And the first part, so the demand, I'm not a specialist on regulation, so I cannot say something on that. What I think is that there's some aspect on the regulation that, for the moment, from a scientific point of view, it's impossible to answer that. I mean, opening the black box, validating some result, for the moment, we don't know how to do that. So that is something interesting, because both community goes together.
Thank you very much. I think there was no more questions, so I'd like to wrap up. I just a last thought on regulation and what you were saying is, when I came to Brussels 20 years ago, companies would always argue with job losses. And I think now it really has changed in terms of the new narrative has become customers won't get access to certain kind of services. So we just see how a narrative driven by lobbyists might have changed. A big round of applause for this fantastic panel. And all the best. And I would like to invite the second panel to come on stage. Yeah, oui, allez-y. Yes.
Yeah, I try to speak English, but I'm new in the material. So.
Okay, I don't know what happened to the light. It's a bit unpleasant here. We were to sit in the dark, so maybe thought it was, yeah. Because otherwise I can't read my notes. Apologies. So I'm glad we can have a further look at certain points that were raised by the speakers, and we have
another high-level panel. Let me introduce our panelists. To my left, we've got Claire Thiriot-Quant. I'm really glad you're here because you stepped in at the last minute with a slightly different angle, because you're the head of the economics and finance section at the embassy here, and you will give us a political angle on Franco-German cooperation on AI. To my left, we've got Matthias Köhler. Well, you say you're new to the area, but still you're heading the unit at the Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Climate Change. You're head of digital, so you should be able to tell us lots. We're hoping for lots of interesting input. To my right, we've got Robert Kilian, board member of the German AI Association, a specialist for regulation. You're a lawyer by training. You're also a lawyer, I believe. And we have another lawyer, last but not least. We have another lawyer. We've got an expert on AI and IP. You didn't step in at the last moment, but you were a late arriver on the list of panelists. I'm delighted to have you here because you'll broaden our horizon. Welcome, Marie-Avril Steinköhler. So our topic will again be regulation, but we're going to focus on the single market as a backdrop, because all the regulation that has been mentioned so far is part of the single market. And I would like to ask, is the single market in its current form, is it a good starting point for innovation and for promoting AI in Europe in general? What do you make of the current state of the internal market?
Thank you for having me here and presenting the view of the federal government and the Ministry of Economics. Yeah, the answer is very simple. What would we have if we hadn't had the single market? I think definitely that's a very, very important foundation. We need more of the single market. That's definitely the first answer that goes beyond the simple yes. Why do we need more? I think we need a capital union. That's very key. I mean, we have been discussing this, or you've been discussing this in the first panel. The key reason why other economies like the US have better developed in these cutting-edge technologies like AI is simply because there is a higher volume of venture capital. So, and of course, our economies are big. France is a big economy, Germany is a big economy, but the US as a market is much bigger. And so this is definitely a clear push, I think should be a clear push to really complete the capital union, to have a better working of the whole financial system. Of course, the marketplaces, the Börse in Frankfurt, La Bourse in Paris. All this is really key because these are the motor for venture capital in the very end, to have the exits of big companies. I think the colleague from coming from the German Bundestag, he really described the phenomenon very, very precisely, that we are really good at innovation at the starting point. We are good at research, and we are even very good at bringing companies on their way, but then scaling up, that's the big issue, and it's a matter of institutional investors, but it's also a matter of exits, all kind of exits, be it the Nasdaq, be it Frankfurt, be it Paris, as places to have a good exit. So that's key to be better in this regard, because I think the research landscape in Europe, be it France, be it Germany, be it Netherlands, be it Denmark, you name it, is still excellent. So the basis also to be global players on an eye is still there.
Thank you very much. So you basically arguing that the internal market needs to be completed, and we all know capital union, we're nowhere near it. I mean, there have been some pushes from France and Germany, but we're sort of really not where we should be. Robert Kilian, is the regulation we have currently, is it really favorable when it comes to innovation?
That's a broad question, but no, I don't think so. I mean, not in every regard. Obviously, when we think about GDPR, then GDPR is something with all its forces and so on, actually, but GDPR is something that, or where other countries, also from particular non-European regions, actually are saying that is something that we might copy. I mean, it has been copied all over the world, in particular in South America, and in other important regions in the world. But nevertheless, obviously, it is a problem still for the companies that are here when now they want to adhere to all these rules, right? I think what we now need to make sure is that with all the other digital regulation that we see now, particularly the AI Act, obviously, but also other regulation like the Data Act, for example, and many more, that we do it in the right way when it now comes to the execution of these acts. I think this is important because what people often don't see, and obviously everybody here in this round is aware, but maybe not all of you, is that in particular the AI Act and also the Data Act, for example, actually they are now a law, right? Because it's in an EU journal for sure. But what people don't know is actually there is, I would say, actually 80% of the work still needs to be done, right? Particularly when it comes now to the execution. So we all know the work needs to be done when it now comes to the supervisory bodies, and in particular pragmatic work of the supervisory bodies. The work needs to be done when it comes to the topic of AI standards, harmonized standards under the AI Act, which is, I think, a topic actually that is that should be much more in the focus, not only in the press, actually, also in political discussions and so on. And it's not enough in the focus at the moment because the harmonized standards are actually that one way where, in particular, SMEs have the possibility to show and to adhere to the AI Act actually in a hopefully pragmatic way. And we have the problem at the moment that these AI standards, when this bridge was built, right? Because it is in the AI Act actually that harmonized standards are foreseen, but the harmonized standards aren't there. And to also say this very clearly, that's not the responsibility of the politics. It's also not the responsibility of the administration, to be honest, to build these AI standards. It's the possibility and the obligation actually of all of us, in particular the industry, right? Obviously, we as an association are involved there. But I think it needs much more work and much more players that need to get involved now.
We'll come back to the implementation because it's a huge topic, and as you rightly say, laws, they get a lot of attention before they are approved in Brussels, and when you have the political debate in Brussels, and when they're approved, people think they're done, but in reality, they aren't. How about the starting point? What kind of position do you see Europe in with the current regulation? Is this a good starting point for innovation to thrive?
Thank you for the question. It's a very difficult question, especially with the French and German representatives at our table. I will first answer in my capacity as a co-president of the French Tech Berlin. So we're French Tech, for those who don't know, it's a government initiative, French government initiative, to foster the creation and the development of startup and scales up in France and of course in Europe. And there are communities abroad of volunteers, entrepreneurs like I am, and like Alicia Combaz, I saw her, people who are supporting that. So yesterday and until this morning, I was at the Bits and Brezel, which is the big German fair about startups, and I discussed with an American creator of a venture capitalist specialized in AI. And I told him, okay, what is your position with the whole situation? And he told me, I'm going to speak this afternoon, he said, to a roundtable at Bits and Brezel, and I will say that I really recommend to a European company to leave the European market in AI. For many reasons. His first reason was the lack of flexibility of the labor market. The second reason was the lack of people. He said, well, I always thought that we have tons of researchers, tons of very, very smart people here in Europe, and said, no, it's not enough. We need more, and it's easier to hire them in the US, so let them come in the US, etc. About financing, surprisingly, he told me, well, when a company is good, it's not such an issue, so we will find the money. Because it's always a topic coming back, financing. And of course, what he said was the problem of regulations. And he said, AI is going very fast. We do not know, it's a kind of black box. We all know that it's a kind of black, that was also said before. We do not know in which direction we go, so we shouldn't give a break to these companies. They should really be able to research, to do whatever they want to do without any limit. And I said, but we know that there must be some limits. There are human rights issues. We need to protect people who are in a vulnerability situation. There are also the issue of the copyrights, etc. And he said, no, we do not know at the moment. And anyway, people are able to control that. So his position was really very hard to say, you should create your company in Ottawa and then move to the US. And he said, well, look at Mistral AI, the French champion. They are now building and developing in the USA. So I would say, first reaction, hot reaction on what I've just heard. It's very impressive. As I would take my second hat, which is a lawyer's hat, specialized in AI and in copyright. I do believe that we need regulations. We need absolutely regulation, and I will give the example of the journalist, which was quoted by Professor Bryson before. The press industry has been suffering a lot for 10, 15 years. They have lost their abos, because people look at the results at Google, etc., Meta, etc. They have lost their publicity's incomes, and it's a real catastrophe. The Copyright Directive tried to implement a kind of payment, which is called the press publishers' rights, but it's a mess. It doesn't work. In Germany, it doesn't work. In France, the Autorité de la Concurrence had to charge Google to pay. Google had to pay fees of 750 million euros to execute this regulation. It doesn't work. So and now we're not ready with that, and AI comes. And all these the Gen AI LLM programs allow to scrap in all these newspapers and to catch the whole information and to give a resume of the information. So it's not necessary anymore to go to read a newspaper. You have all the answers there. It's not possible for journalists, it's not always possible for journalists also to prove that their copyrights have been stolen, because, it's words. How can you say that this word belongs to you? It's very complicated. So there's a problem of protecting their copyrights. And of course, there's LLMs who replace someday the press industry. So what was the reaction? This copyright regulation said there is the possibility for press publishers to opt out and for any company to opt out. But what do you do? The New York Times, for example, they made a process. Getty Images made the process with ChatGPT. Some other try to make an agreement. For example, Axel Springer, they have concluded a direct agreement. But what does it mean, a direct agreement? Axel Springer is the most powerful press publishers in Germany. So he has the power. They have the power to conclude such an agreement. What are you going to do with a local newspaper? They will not conclude an agreement with ChatGPT. It's over. So there's really a problem of diversity. And I would say that the last problem I see that, okay, let's say we opt out. We don't want, we're newspapers, but it's the same for my website, for example, for my law firm or for any stock image company. You decide to opt out and to say to ChatGPT and the others, no, don't take my content. But at the end of the day, you disappear from knowledge. You do not appear anymore. And I heard some African politicians who said, we mustn't do that because we want to be part of history. We want to be part of actuality. So there's also a problem of sovereignty of Europe about these issues. Well, this is, thank you. It was a little bit long, but...
Thank you very much. We've seen there's a first case in Germany. I just read about this this morning, where a photographer sued a company, but it's just a poor one-person organization, and he lost because it was for scientific purposes. He couldn't prove that there was a commercial interest behind it. So this is a huge issue you're raising. I'd like to come to you as a starting point. The current regulation, does it serve us? Does it serve innovation?
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me for this panel. If I may, I will switch to French because we have a translator, and perhaps it's good for them also to work a little bit. Bon, en fait, la question sur la régulation, j'ai l'impression, en écoutant aussi le collègue du ministère de l'économie, qu'on est à peu près à mi-chemin. Il faut quand même comprendre que cette législation dont on parle, AI Act ou Data Act ou Data Governance Act, elles sont toutes très récentes, elles sont à peine en cours de déploiement, et donc je dirais, alors en anglais, the jury is still out. Et quand même, ces régulations, on a entendu des avis très partagés, des avis disant que ça serait un avantage comparatif pour les entreprises européennes. C'est aussi une régulation qui est mise en place pour préserver des intérêts quand même assez fondamentaux, des droits fondamentaux, des processus, on parle de processus électoraux, on parle de la santé, on parle d'éviter des discriminations, des biais, etc. Donc, il faut effectivement trouver une balance. Cette balance, je ne suis pas spécialiste de AI Act, mais j'ai l'impression que dans les négociations au cours de laquelle d'ailleurs la France et l'Allemagne ont travaillé main dans la main pour arriver à trouver cet équilibre, fragile équilibre entre l'innovation, préserver la capacité d'innovation en Europe et la régulation qui est effectivement indispensable.
Thank you very much. You said it's very important to find a balance, an equilibrium. At the same time, I found a figure in the Draghi report, which is pretty impressive because we've got 100 tech-focused laws in the EU at this moment, and there are over 270 regulators active in digital matters across member states. That means on average 10 regulators per state, probably a lot more from Germany. And we've had this discussion earlier on. Does the regulation serve us, or is it too complicated, especially for small companies? Because if we want to foster startups, they don't have the capacity to deal with a lot of regulation. What's your view on that?
Well, I can completely agree with what has been said so far. I mean, we have put this regulation now into place. Since 1st of August, it is there. there are these transitional periods until...
This is the AI regulation
The
you're talking
AI
about.
regulation,
Yeah,
exactly,
because
exactly.
I mean, also we could talk about
Yeah, but,
data, GDPR.
Exactly, but
data
now talk
really-
about AI Act. We have 2 years for the whole implementation, the execution to find the code of practices and all the rest. And this is really very, very important to put it into place that it works. So that's really, really key. So the regulation or the finish in European Parliament was only the starting point. And the process of developing the codes of practices has only started. Yesterday was the first round on general purpose AI. Now there will be the next consultation with regard to those practices that are forbidden, so Article 5. And there's a lot of interest in what we are doing. Yesterday, I think I was informed that 800 to 1,000 participants were in this consultation process, and not only from Europe, but from all over the world. So what I would say, of course, those that are driving innovation, they do not want any regulation. They want full freedom. But I really agree with Marie that, hey, there are so important fundamental values and rights involved here that we cannot simply say we do not need any regulation. There is a tension between innovation and rules, regulation, of course, but I think we really have to be clear on the way we want to live here in Europe and how our economies should work. It is, I agree, I'm pretty new in this field, so in the last 9 years I was in charge of questions of corporate financing, venture capital, and what have you. And then since 1st of June, I've changed my competencies in the ministry, and now I'm in charge of among other issues, AI Act. And of course, when I looked into it, coming from the startup thinking, my first impression was also, whoa, this will be difficult to implement in a good way. But when you go more deeply into the matter, I think at one point or the other, you need to regulate. You're simply forced to. And one reflection that I've made when starting to better understand my new competency was that I also see that in other constituencies like the US, you've got the big law suits that are now taking place, like the New York Times against OpenAI and the issues. And this will lead also to some kind of limits on how you can train your general purpose AI system. Of course, it has to be like that because Marie really put it put us on the spot here. We have copyrights here, and copyrights of big journals, of newspapers. That is not something where we can say, it doesn't matter whether our free press still has an economic basis in the future. No, I mean, this is the basis for our democracy. Do we want to sell out our democracy? You can say, okay, maybe we have different forms of self-sustainable free press, but so far, to be honest, they haven't developed. They haven't developed. So far, the data is produced by some who put a lot of money into it. They have an economic system or model that has worked so far, and they are in danger. So to say all this doesn't matter to us, sorry, this is too simple. And there are other issues related to the regulation. I think where we really have to be serious here. it's also a question, how do you set up general purpose AI systems with regard to energy safety, energy security? There are also really serious questions that have to be dealt with. And to be honest, I mean, also in the US, people see this. Why does the US have this track with AI Safety Institute? I mean, there's a reason for that, because people see dangers. And those who are really the front runners of the general purpose AI models, the front runners, they tell us, hey, we are really entering a phase where it can become very dangerous. So I would say, really, for in the last 9 years, my whole focus was on innovation. So please don't misunderstand me. And I still think that this is absolutely key for our economies in Europe to develop. So we need to put the AI Act into practice, that innovation can develop, and that the US colleague you talked to was wrong. I hope he was wrong, of course. So let's work together on this.
Thank you very much. Thank you for explaining the rationale behind the regulation, because you said, you know, it's not being done for the sake of regulating, but there is a rationale behind it. We need press. We need a free press for democracy. There is a reason why we're doing it. At the same time, do you think there is a risk of fragmentation if the AI Act is not implemented in a very uniform manner across Europe? If every country, I mean, obviously it'll be implemented nationally. Do you think there is a huge danger of gold plating, which means adding, you know, additional standards? I saw in a hearing at the Bundestag, there was a question of what we do about workers' rights. You know, is this ensured? And then all sorts of different interests come into this. And obviously, for European companies, the best outcome would be a uniform implementation.
Yes, I think there is a risk. For sure. And we've seen that with other regulation as well, right? I mean, if you take the fintech sector, for example, we've seen a lot of regulatory arbitrage in that regard, in that industry, right? Where, and I was working in the fintech industry for a long time before I was doing AI testing, AI regulation. And the thing is, I mean, back in 2015, 2012, we had the situation actually that fintech founders were thinking of going to Malta or going to Luxembourg or the Baltic states actually in order to get a license easily. That was the saying, the original saying, right? Easily. I mean, back in 2014, 15, it was really like, for fintech founders, if I want to have a license, I go to the Baltic states actually, and I get that within a couple of days. That was basically the saying back then. It changed, I know, meanwhile, actually. But the thing I think, or the one thing I think we can learn out of that is that we do it in a different way now with AI regulation, right? Because what we really want to have is one harmonized European market, and regulatory arbitrage is something I think we can never exclude totally, obviously, because there's different supervisory bodies, and also out of the AI, obviously what we see is there is different obligations also now on the national level, different things that now needs to be executed on the national level, and obviously there will be differences. I totally get that. And to a certain level, competition is also a good thing, also when it comes to administration, right? So I like that. But let's make sure this competition is focused on the parts in the AI actually that are innovation friendly and that actually should foster innovation. I give you an example. The example is regulatory sandboxes, for example. I very much like the idea, the general idea. I think we can, again, learn lots out of regulatory sandbox experience from the fintech sector, where also something like that was planned around 10 years ago. It didn't really work out in Germany. It worked out, to my experience, in the UK, where it was handled a bit differently. We can talk about that, obviously, if anyone is interested here. But I think that is the one thing where, for example, we can have a certain level of competition, right? Where I think member states should really put out every idea and maybe do collaborations with associations, with testing centers, also between nations, obviously, we can have collaborations, right, and set up regulatory sandboxes that really work, that really attract founders all over Europe. Because the one thing you don't want to have when you set up a regulatory sandbox, to have that example, or to look at that example maybe in more detail actually, is you don't want to have only founders from Berlin, right, in that regulatory sandbox. That's boring, and that's actually also not helping the one purpose that has for the regulatory sandbox, and that one purpose is actually that you can learn vice versa, right? Because the regulatory sandbox is obviously not only there to help companies, the regulatory sandbox is also there to help the authorities to learn how companies, in particular AI companies in that regard, work. And for that, it's in particular important that also the authorities obviously see a range of AI companies with a range of AI use cases, and not only a Berlin bubble AI company state. That's I think the one thing that's important. Let me also add one sentence to the discussion we had before, because that was super interesting, to maybe switch to that topic only for a couple of sentences again, because I would love to, I would have loved been to be part of that discussion that you had with that US investor, because I had that discussion 1,000 times since 10 years. I can for sure say. The one thing obviously I'm saying, obviously, and I agree with that guy, is that in particular when it comes to later stage companies, the access to capital, you also said it, and in particular the IPO market obviously is way different, right? And the possibilities on the capital market are much better in the US than they are in Europe. We all know that. And for that, obviously later stage companies think of that. But what I'm also saying always in the discussion is that, and I know a couple of companies actually that did that actually have now a topco in Delaware, very likely, for reasons, is that, and that's the one thing that they don't see, is that then also your whole governance in the company is actually US corporate law. Do they know that? I mean, I'm not quite sure actually, and also tax law and stuff. It's like, it's not that you can go there, actually have a topco in Delaware actually, and then you basically have no regulations, right? That's not true. It's simply not true. And I know that from first-hand experience from advising clients actually that did that, having a topco now in Delaware, that this is becoming a problem on the other side of the regulation. Yeah? So I agree very much with regard to capital market, in particular financing. It's obviously a lot more easy if you have a good idea to do the financing there. I don't agree with rationale that regulation in general actually is not a problem anymore if you move your topco to the US. It's not true. And a last sentence actually, it's also not true when we talk about AI system regulation. It was, I'm obviously not saying something now against you, I'm saying something against the guy, right? So don't get that wrong, because you were just telling us, and it's a super perfect example of what discussions I have at the moment now really, really often. And the one thing I also want to say is half a year ago, it was like that, right? That basically in the US, we had no plans, or a year ago, we had almost no plans actually to regulate AI systems, right? So we had cars driving around in Austin, driving over people, right? And basically there was no law, obviously, like preventing this for them. So that was a problem. And then meanwhile, we know actually there are huge plans in almost every industry region in the world, in particular in the US. Obviously, we know the California AI bill was just blocked at the moment, and I say blocked very particular actually because we don't know what will happen. I think they will work on that law now again actually, and then will come through for sure. But it's also, if you talk about product safety in the US, product safety is state law, right? So it's fine if we now talk about California, but there's also a Colorado AI bill, there's a New York State AI bill, and to be honest, also the there were some AI system regulations, in particular with regard to HR systems, actually, that were existent way before the AI Act, right? So what I very much doubt is actually that you don't have to cope with AI regulation if you move your topco or your company actually to the US. They will install more laws actually, and they have AI regulation laws, and they had them way before the AI Act was introduced.
So next time we should have someone here who has moved their company and have slowly discovered the amount of US law. I found a figure, it doesn't sound that impressive, but I think it's interesting nevertheless. The Belgian economist Jacques Pelgmans, he reckons that some 40 European startups, high-tech startups per year shift towards the US because the single market is too complicated for them and they don't attract sufficient finance. 40 doesn't sound like a lot, but if it's 40 really good ones, it's a huge economic loss.
I may say something. I do agree with you for the law, and the GDPR has been copied everywhere, and it has really changed the world. So it's I'm sure. I have the impression that for the United States, we are at the moment a kind of laboratory. Europe, that they use us and they say, what's happening? What are they doing? How are we going to do the same? I'm sure, of course, and liability is an issue in the US. So liability will anyway, the insurance company will say, stop, we need to find a solution with AI. So no, I do agree with all those issues. If I may jump on another subject about, of course, regulation is an issue. Of course, we have to cope with that, etc., etc. But it's also security. When you know what's going to happen, you know in which direction you have to go. So you know how you have to develop, and there is an uncertainty everywhere worldwide. So everybody is looking at what we're doing. And of course, we have this reputation of regulating, but what we're doing is very important and is going to be copied and has already been. So this is a major issue. There is, yeah. I would love to jump on another subject we talked about but I.
Sandboxes?
Yeah.
Or what I find interesting is the argument cooperation among regulators or competition, because you said it might be good to have competition in terms of nations coming up with a better application or implementation of the AI Act and then attracting companies, or do we need a cooperation? Would you like to say something about that? And I think
I would like to come back on this issue of innovation that you also addressed, sandboxes, and add another idea. I think we're looking at the work of the AI office and the AI board. And Tina Decker, who is just leading the whole department in which I work, she's the German representative in the AI board, so I follow that very closely, and we're preparing it. Now, I think what is now very important is that we do not only concentrate on the risk side of the regulation. That's very important, of course, but we also need to clearly define those spaces where there's no risk. So whitelisting, that's the issue here. I think the regulation is complex, true, but in a certain way, it is also very clear because there are certain practices like social scoring, for instance, and others are named there, which you can clearly define. And when you do that, from doing that, you also come to the point where you can say, look, there's a whole space where you are free to develop your AI. And I think for the German industry, that's very, very important because, yes, it is true, we are not the front runner with the general purpose AI models. That comes from the US, and we have certain little plans also developing in Germany, but that's really not where we are the front runners, unfortunately. But where the German economy is strong is, of course, with a lot of products, machinery, medical devices, cars, trucks, whatever. So there's really a lot. And what we really have to do is we have to define those spaces where you are in a free zone, risk-free. And by doing this, I think we also change the narrative going with the AI Act, because it is now seen as a regulation that stops, or might be seen, that stops innovation. I think first it is good because it can give us a clear view on a basis for investment, but we, in terms of innovation, and that's important to invest, and for this you need to know what is the rule. But the other question, how can we innovate? We need to define those spaces where there's no risk, and these spaces are huge, I think. And why do I say this? I want to prevent us from only reducing the innovation aspects of the AI Act to sandboxes. You know, I mean, I'm on panels on the AI Act every week, and last week I had a super panel with people from different companies, commerce, people really produce machinery, and everywhere there are AI tools in use, they are developed. And I'm sure if we are really smart in defining those applications that we do not want, and which the AI Act clearly defines, there's still a lot of space for innovation, and that's really, and I totally agree with you. What is now important, we need to develop these codes of practices very, very quickly to have this clear view for everyone where these spaces of innovation are.
Yeah, I think it's a very good reminder to reframe the whole discussion in terms of opportunities rather than sort of being repressed, rather than seeing the AI Act as some straitjacket that sort of doesn't allow us to breathe. Franco-German cooperation in this one, or maybe competition is also. I'm an economist. I always believe in competition. What's your view?
Non, oui. Je reviendrai donc sur un peu sur les propos de l'ambassadeur, en fait, qui avait bien remis le cadre. On a bien vu dans toute cette discussion les enjeux derrière de l'IA et plus globalement toutes ces nouvelles technologies. C'est quand même la capacité de l'Europe à être plus compétitive, productive, etc. Donc on joue gros. Et ça, effectivement, nos gouvernements, les deux pays, l'ont bien identifié et ont souhaité travailler ensemble, notamment dans la perspective d'une nouvelle commission. Et c'est de ça dont je voudrais parler rapidement, peut-être. En partant du principe, justement, qu'on avait pas mal de complémentarité dans nos tissus d'entreprise et de start-up en franco-allemand. Nous étant, d'après ce que je comprends un peu plus, sur des modèles de fondation, on a des entreprises qui sont effectivement assez performantes, et l'Allemagne ayant beaucoup plus donc ce tissu industriel avec la capacité à générer des données, et les données c'est la base un peu finalement de ce qu'on cherche à gagner avec ces intelligences artificielles. Donc si on raisonne et si on se dit est-ce que si on combine nos deux forces et qu'on l'étend évidemment à l'Europe, on aura certainement un driver assez fort pour la croissance et la compétitivité en Europe. Donc ce sujet a été abordé au plus haut niveau. Et comme l'a rappelé l'ambassadeur, d'ailleurs, c'est un sujet qui avait été identifié dès 2019 dans le traité d'Aix-la-Chapelle. C'est quand même assez impressionnant, c'était assez visionnaire si on se replace à cette période où personne n'avait entendu, enfin les non-initiés ne connaissaient pas vraiment toutes ces dimensions sur le développement de l'IA générative, etc. Donc dans le traité d'Aix-la-Chapelle, une feuille de route une feuille de route avec des très beaux projets. Je voudrais en citer quelques-uns parce que là, on est dans du concret. Alors, il y avait un projet, d'ailleurs, on en a fêté les premiers résultats ici à l'ambassade il y a quelques jours. Ça s'appelle IOLO. C'est en fait, c'est l'utilisation de l'IA pour détecter et répondre aux épidémies. Et c'est un projet qui a associé Sanofi Pasteur avec Fraunhofer Institut. Voilà. Donc voilà des exemples de coopération concrète, encouragée par les pouvoirs publics, parce qu'il y avait un petit peu de fonds publics, et puis surtout de la coopération entre des acteurs. Voilà. Une dizaine de projets comme ça ont été financés et sont toujours en cours de développement. À Hambourg, donc pour revenir sur les priorités en matière d'IA de nos deux gouvernements, il a été décidé donc de travailler de concert sur la négociation à l'époque de l'IA Act et puis maintenant sur la mise en œuvre. Donc je crois que nos équipes travaillent ensemble pour précisément préserver cet équilibre entre innovation et régulation. On a décidé aussi de travailler sur les espaces de données. On a évoqué le fait que les données étaient les clés pour nourrir ces modèles. Et donc, il faut que l'Europe, et que la France et l'Allemagne peut-être commencent à travailler sur ces données. Des données un peu complexes, hein, la santé, etc., qui posent des défis assez importants. Le rapprochement des écosystèmes, on en a parlé. Alors, ça veut dire de manière concrète, là je laisserai mon collègue chef du service scientifique, conseiller scientifique, peut-être compléter. Il y a des actions en cours pour rapprocher le monde de la recherche français et allemand. Il y a eu un accord renouvelé récemment entre l'INRIA et la DFKI. Voilà. Il y a un projet de réunion des clusters de l'IA français et de leurs équivalents allemands. Il y a la French Tech, c'est quand même un superbe écosystème, certes, qui n'est pas forcément dédié uniquement à l'IA, mais qui fait se rencontrer nos startups, nos venture capital, les players, les labos, etc. Et dernier sujet sur lequel donc nos gouvernements ont décidé de mettre aussi la priorité, on en a parlé, c'est l'union des marchés des capitaux, parce que effectivement tout ça nécessite des financements. Et je rappellerai qu'il y a quand même aussi une initiative, et je crois que vous étiez en charge de ce dossier à l'époque. On a, il y a déjà 18 mois ou 2 ans, créé une initiative qui s'appelle European Tech Champion Initiative. Et c'est en fait, au départ, une idée ou un projet franco-allemand qui a été élargi au niveau européen pour rassembler des fonds publics d'abord, pour investir dans des fonds européens, justement pour accompagner le financement des scale-up en Europe. Donc, ETCI, c'est un beau modèle. Pourra-t-on faire un ETCI de l'IA? Question mark. Et enfin, comme on a dit que les financements publics seraient contraints, quels que soient les pays, enfin en Europe, tout au moins, je crois qu'on peut effectivement aussi citer l'initiative TIBI française, qui est une manière de mobiliser des fonds des investisseurs institutionnels vers le venture capital pour financer de nouveau ces scale-up à des tickets quand même beaucoup plus importants, 100 millions, 200 millions, ce qui nous manque en Europe actuellement, et que l'Allemagne vient de également faire la même chose, cette même démarche. Et alors, on peut se prendre à rêver que si on l'a fait en France, en Allemagne, on pourrait le faire en franco-allemand et en européen.
Un grand merci. Thank you very much. So we've seen there's already a lot that is happening. I would like to open the floor if there are any questions to our panelists. Yeah, the lady up there, and then we've got.
Yes, thank you so much, Annalisa Wirth. Happy to be here today. My question would be, you talked a lot about whether it's good to have regulation or not, so it's like a bit polarized, but actually there's different ways of having regulation and implementing it, right? I mean, the co-regulation of working with big companies to actually write up on policies together and on regulations came up, and there's different modes of actually implementing that. So what initiatives and space do you see there to actually change the way that regulation is done or adapted in a way to actually foster innovation instead of like hampering it? And where do you see clear limitations of maybe some stuff that has been proposed that is not working for European law? Thank you.
Who would like to answer this? It's a hard one.
Just say one thing, two things. What I think is really great now, it's that it's a regulation. So it's a text which is going to be applied in whole Europe. It's not a directive, which is a very important thing. And the second thing that the work with the stakeholders, the collaboration is very intensive. So we do not stop talking together with consumers, with enterprises, etc., etc. So my impression that the way this regulation is being made is very smart, but this is my opinion as a user.
Anyone else?
Yeah, only one sentence to add. I think a good idea is actually technical standards in general. I mean, we've seen that in the AI Act, we've seen that in other regulations, and obviously it's a good way or type of regulation because you don't have that sort of knowledge actually in the ministries normally, right? I mean, you would agree, I think, right? Obviously, ministries and administration is perfect actually in writing the law, the hard law, so to say. But in particular, when it comes to regulation that has so many digital aspects, that has so many new technology in it that needs to be regulated actually, then it's always, I think, a good idea to put that one on technical standards. That has happened with the AI Act as well, and I think that is working out as an idea at the moment. Let's put it like this, because there's, and this is the limitation you asked about at the moment, and again, I urge all of you that are working in the AI community to please be part within these technical standards. Not only in the GPI Code of Practice, but also in the technical standards for high-risk AI systems. This is the other part, right? And it's important actually that we all take part in this, because what will happen, I can assure you, if we don't finish within now the 2 years time frame, or let's say 1.5 years actually, because obviously also companies need to implement, right? So it should be more 1 to 1.5 years, to be very honest. What will happen then is that companies, in particular SMEs, that don't have legal departments, don't have compliance departments, actually don't know what to do. This I can really say from my experience firsthand with talking with these companies, because obviously, I mean, if you ask now founders of AI companies, maybe they have 10 people, and they don't have a legal and compliance employees actually to talk with, then you would say to them, yeah, please read Article 8 to Article 15 in the AI Act, and then please understand actually what it means for your high-risk system, what you now need to implement, what risk management system you need to implement, and so on and so on. They're super confused. Obviously, nobody of them understands that, right? And we're now talking, one last sentence, sorry, we're talking about innovation again, because you were talking about it a bit, actually. That is another part of the AI Act that is, for me, innovation. The technical standards actually is a bridge for companies, in particular SMEs, to fulfill the high-risk requirements. And this is something we need to understand. It's not an extra regulation that is now put on high-risk systems, actually. It's a bridge that we, as the industry, can use, and we now need to be part of it.
I can only support what you've been saying. There's one issue related to the AI Act where we as Europe, the European Parliament, has put us into danger. And let's be frank on that. The time frame is very, very ambitious. I've only come to this scene 1st of June, but I was really, really shocked, because what is now needed is technical standards, is authorities to be designed, staff to be found in order to put all this into place. And if you look into the time frame that the AI has set, I really wonder whether this was very wise, to be honest. I see a lot of ambition that Europe wants to show we make this regulation and here it is and strict, but still things are complicated. I mean, yes, I know Germany is particularly complicated, all right, we are known for our bureaucracy, but as I've heard, other countries are also difficult in this regard. And I wonder whether we can really reach all these time targets. We'll have to see.
It's really interesting because earlier we heard that regulation needs to be faster. And I think it just shows that we have, there's always a trade-off. Do we want to go fast or do we want to be thorough? And there's probably no perfect answer. But, there was the ambition to do something fast. And then now you say there's a lot of pressure. There was a gentleman up there who raised his hand. Okay, so you go first and then the gentleman.
Sorry. I'm Annika. I'm a Master of International Affairs student at the Hertie School. I'm definitely not an expert on AI, but I just find it very interesting, let alone on the EU AI Act. But what I'm wondering is that, to me, the development in the recent years have been a bit of a watershed in the way we're going to live and work and everything. And I'm asking myself if the means of regulations that we have are actually enough in order to regulate this, or whether, in a way, only AI can regulate AI, or like, in that sense, like, let's say you have a deep fake and you want to make sure that they are discovered online, whether that's maybe only possible through an AI algorithm that can detect deepfakes, that it would need a lot of research, a lot of development, etc. So maybe.
Okay, thank you. And now the gentleman in the blue shirt.
Thank you very much. My name is Sebastian Steinert. I'm a PhD researcher from the University of Düsseldorf. We've talked a lot about the AI Act, but also about market concentration, and we haven't talked so much about the Digital Markets Act. So I was wondering, what potential do you see to leverage the DMA to kind of like fight market concentration in artificial intelligence and help especially the SMEs to develop a competitive AI in Europe?
Thank you very much. We haven't talked about the DSA either. And unfortunately, Joanna Bryson is not with us any longer because she actually says, compared to the previous regulation, the AI Act is literally an afterthought, that some of the things happening elsewhere are actually much more important. But unfortunately, we don't have her here. Who would like to come in on the first question?
I can briefly answer that. I think the answer that maybe you asked for is actually monitoring. I'm also running a testing company for AI systems actually, and there's two ways of testing AI systems at the moment, right? One is actually you do what all the testing companies were doing with regard to product safety for the last 30 years. Actually, you go with an unscalable in an unscalable way. You go to an industry manufacturer actually with like 2 or 3 testing people actually, and you ask questions over and over again actually, and at the very end you have a result. Obviously, with regard to automotive manufacturing, also you have tests on the street, right? Actually, and you have certain mechanical tests that you do actually. That's true. That's the one thing you can do. Also with regard to AI systems, obviously, and this is also to a certain extent what we're doing at the moment actually. We're going to bigger automotive players, manufacturing players, medicine product providers, and so on, actually, and we ask the developers certain questions based on a obviously defined and very exhaustive catalog, right? With regard to data privacy, with regard to reliability of the system, with regard to robustness of the data sets, and so on and so on. And obviously, you can get a good feeling by testing that, right? But we know already, and that is also something that is already foreseen, in particular in Article 9 of the AI Act, who's interested about that actually, is that we need software-based automated tests in the very end for AI systems. So these question-based tests actually don't make sense. And that's the reason why we are working so much on that, also on the software side on that one. And it's not only us, actually, it's a couple of others also working on that at the moment. And when we're talking about software-based tests, obviously it's also AI-based tests because AI is also only a type of software, right, in the end. And we see that in particular interesting for automotive industries, where obviously there is a certain interest to monitor AI systems, in particular those AI systems that have influence on safety relevant other product parts, right? The brakes, the lights, and so on. You all know, I'm 100% sure actually you all will drive maybe today, tomorrow in a car, actually out of that Berlin street, 10 meters from here actually, with 10 to 15 AI systems, live AI systems in it, in the brake control, for example, in the park assistance, and so on. And the funny thing is, to talk about only one last sentence about regulation again, actually, these systems are not checked at the moment. So we in Germany, actually, we check everything, right? We check the elevators, we check like the tires, we check like everything, obviously, but the AI system live in the car is not checked. And I'm saying this because it's a very good example, actually, for where regulation, in particular under the AI Act, makes sense, right? Because this is a typical example for actually where I would say it makes sense, and let's regulate these particular AI systems. I think it's common sense actually with regard to automotive. I've never heard somebody saying, yeah, we should check the brakes, we should check the lighting system and so on actually, but we shouldn't check the AI system in the car. It doesn't make any sense, right? So that's a good example, but obviously there are many more examples actually where we should make sure that innovation comes first and not regulation.
Okay, and a brief answer on the DMA. Anyone on the DMA? I think you probably should have put that question to the previous panel. I don't see anyone particularly eager to answer it. You certainly do have a point. So I think looking at my watch, I get the feeling it's time to wrap up. I would love to thank this expert panel. It was a pleasure having you here. We saw that there's a lot going on in terms of Franco-German cooperation. We also saw that there is a lot that still needs to be done. But let me thank you all and the interpreters for being here today, and pass the floor.
If you could stay for just 5 minutes, let me just quickly wrap up. And thank you all for coming here. Just quickly, I came here as a relatively novice to AI. We in the Jacques Delors Center, we do a lot on European governance, different economic policies, but not so much on AI. And I've learned a hell of a lot, really a lot. It was excellent panels, excellent interventions. And I leave here much more optimistic, I have to say. Optimistic because, first of all, you perceive the issue very much as a European issue, and you really pinpointed a lot of opportunities, be it on the employment side, be it on the example of the applications where maybe Europe can add much more. And also, we're perceiving AI as a sort of common challenge. We're perceiving it as an opportunity to also think about, as Europeans, what are the values we stand for? So in a way, it unites us. And maybe because AI is so new, we don't have so many vested interests, existing standards that we need to harmonize. We can build a new, and there maybe the European level is the natural one. We also discussed quite a lot about what are the tools for AI? And I think there it was very interesting. We had a lot of focus on regulation, but we also saw what is the interplay to other instruments, the financing, capital markets union, energy was a very important topic raised, skills and training. And here, of course, and that brings me in a way to my third point, I think we still need an upgrade of where Europe delivers. I think there is a tendency to agree on the overall headlines, but I mean, let me not start on capital markets union, how challenging then some of the technical issues are. And maybe, and that's a bit taking us back to the intervention that the ambassador did at the beginning, maybe there is an opportunity in AI because it focused minds. There is a strong consensus Franco-German on that topic. There is a potential for leadership. And even though all our countries at the moment, both of our countries are very much focused with the challenge of populism, with domestic politics, but maybe on AI there is a consensus where, and they're taking the words of the ambassador, where maybe sort of an AI community could be sort of a new a new impetus to address the thorny issues like energy, capital markets union, and so on, that are very helpful to pursue AI. And with that hope, I want to really thank everyone, not only the guests and the speakers, but if I may, also the teams that have made this possible. Jan, Linda, and all the others from the Franco-German team, but also from the embassy here, Claire, Siegfried, Lorraine, Mathilde. So thank you very much. This was a great joint effort. I also want to thank the Foreign Office for financing us. We have another event coming up, Pariser Platz, which is end of November, where we look specifically on what are the new priorities of the Commission and the new legislator, coming back to sort of the horizontal point I made in the connection to the other policies. And Pariser Platz is also the nice kind of term, because this is where we are, so over at the residence of the ambassador, where we have now the buffet. And I'm very happy to take you all with us and go over to the buffet to have a further discussion on many of the aspects we touched upon. So thank you very much.